The candle has already burned low. Somewhere in the house above you, a clock is ticking. The long, patient tick of a mantel clock in a room where no one is sitting. The fire in the grate has gone from orange to red to a low, breathing amber, and the light it casts against the plaster ceiling moves like something alive, something slow and unhurried. Outside, the city makes its sounds, the particular sounds of a city in winter, when the cobblestones are cold and the horse's breath comes in small white clouds, and the gas lights burn at every corner like solitary lanterns left by someone who forgot to come back. You are resting. You are already further from the day than you were a moment ago. The weight of the quilt, the sound of the fire. These things are your world now, and they are enough. They are more than enough. The year is 1887, and in the great houses of New York City the world is arranged with extraordinary care. Everything in its place, every person in their role. The silver has been polished, the crystal has been counted, the calling cards have been left and received and filed in the little lacquered box on the hall table, and tomorrow the whole machinery of society will turn again, precisely as it has always turned. But somewhere tonight, in one of those great houses, behind a door that has been locked from the inside, in a room where the maid has been sent away and the gaslight turned very low, a woman is sitting at a writing desk. She's not writing a letter to anyone who knows her name. She's writing a set of instructions, careful instructions, the kind that only make sense if you understand how completely a person can vanish, even when the whole world thinks it knows exactly where she is. Settle in. Let the fire do what fires do. This is a story about the women who found a way to be two places at once, and what it cost them, and what it gave them, and why, on certain nights when the candle burns low, you can almost feel the shape of their longing in the air, still there, still warm, still wanting. You find yourself, in this quiet hour, inside a world that has almost entirely vanished. The Gilded Age. The phrase itself has a particular weight, a particular gleam, like something that looks like gold but is only gold-coloured, something bright on the surface and complicated beneath. Mark Twain, who gave the era its name, meant it as a warning as much as a description. He saw the shine and knew what it concealed. The inequality, the performance, the vast machinery of appearances that required so many human beings to spend their entire lives maintaining something that was, at its core, a fiction. The great houses of Fifth Avenue stood like a parade of ambitions made permanent. Marble from Italy, tapestries from France, staircases wide enough to drive a carriage up, designed so that a woman in a Fulworth gown, 40 yards of silk, a train 6 feet long, could descend without brushing either wall. The architects understood their commission. These houses were not homes in any ordinary sense. They were stages. The women who lived in them were not simply wealthy. They were performers. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. You are comfortable now. Let the day dissolve. There is nothing you need to reach for, nothing that requires your attention. What follows is a story that will carry you gently, in the way that stories about other people's lives sometimes do, giving you a world to inhabit that is not your own, a set of rooms to move through that are different from the ones you know. The women of the Gilded Age were watched constantly. This is not an exaggeration. From the moment a daughter of wealth was old enough to be presented to society, and this happened somewhere between the ages of 17 and 20, at a debutante ball that cost more than most families earned in several years, she was never, in the fullest sense of the word, alone. There was always a chaperone, always a maid nearby, always someone noting what she wore, whom she spoke to, how long she lingered at the punch table. The society columns in the New York Herald and the World track these women the way a naturalist tracks a species of rare bird. Every sighting catalogued, every anomaly noted. And yet some of them disappeared. Not in the dramatic way of runaway brides, not with the cover of darkness and a hired carriage at midnight. They disappeared differently, more quietly, more ingeniously. They found a way to be present and absent simultaneously. They discovered, through patience and creativity and a particular kind of desperation, that a woman in their position could purchase almost anything, including, if she were careful enough and lucky enough, the temporary illusion of her own absence. They hired actresses to be them. This is the simple, extraordinary heart of what we're here to explore tonight. Women with the means and the nerve arrange for other women, performers mostly, women whose profession was already the occupation of other identities, to appear at the events, the calls, the carriage rides, the opera boxes, the charity teas that constituted the Gilded Age social calendar. While the substitute sat in the ballroom, smiling the right smile, wearing the right pearls, exchanging the right pleasantries with the right people, the real woman was somewhere else entirely. Where did they go, these vanished wives? That is part of what this story explores. The answers are various and sometimes surprising. Some went to suffrage meetings. Some went to small studios on the Lower West Side where artists painted their portraits without chaperones, without corsets, without the careful performance of who they were supposed to be. Some went to places that no longer exist, small, specific places where the world was organized differently, where women could speak their own thoughts aloud without consequence. Some went to their lovers, some went to themselves. Let the room go dark around you now except for one light, the low warm light of a story. We are going back. We are going to the houses on Fifth Avenue, and the summer cottages at Newport, and the backstage rooms of the New York theatrical world, and the locked parlours and the secret letters and the women who found, even inside the gilded cage, a small improbable key. To understand what these women were escaping from, you have to understand the house itself, not just the size of it, though the size was astonishing, but the way it was organised, the way it was designed to contain. A Gilded Age mansion on Fifth Avenue was, in its spatial logic, a machine for producing appearances. Every room had a function, every function had a correct occupant. The library was for gentlemen after dinner. The morning room was where the lady of the house received her first callers of the day. The drawing room was for formal gatherings of a mixed company. The boudoir was, theoretically, private, but even the boudoir had its schedule of maids and dressers and ladies' companions, who moved through it on a timetable as regulated as any factory floor. The houses were not quiet. This surprises some people, who imagine wealth as a kind of insulation from noise, but a Gilded Age mansion employed between 30 and 50 servants, depending on the season and the scale of the household, and the sounds of that labour were constant. Fires were laid before dawn. Coal was carried in scuttles up and down the back stairs. Silver was polished in the butler's pantry. Bread was baked in the kitchen below the street level, and the smell of it came up through the floors, mingling with the smell of wood polish and cut flowers and the faint, permanent smell of coal smoke that never entirely left the walls, no matter how many times the curtains were washed. You are resting now, and all of that is very far away. The sounds you hear, if you hear anything at all, are the sounds of this room, this night, this moment, the small sounds, the ones that tell you the world is still there but has grown quiet around you. A woman of position in the 1880s woke typically between 7 and 8 in the morning. Not by choice, she rarely chose anything so basic as when to wake, but because her lady's maid arrived at that hour with hot water in a pitcher, and the morning papers, and the previous day's calling cards arranged in their silver dish. The lady would wash, and the maid would help her dress, and dressing was not a simple act. A morning dress in 1887 might involve a corset with 20 individual laces that needed to be tightened to a particular measurement. 18 inches was the fashionable ideal, though many women settled for 20 or 22, because 18 made breathing difficult at anything above a walk. Over the corset went a chemise, a petticoat, a bustle that stood out from the back of the skirt like an architectural afterthought. Then the dress itself, which buttoned up the back with a row of small buttons that required a special hook to fasten. A hook that was almost impossible to use on yourself. This is worth understanding. The clothes that wealthy women wore in this period were designed, intentionally or not, so that a woman could not dress herself unaided. She needed help to get dressed in the morning and help to get undressed at night. She was, in the most literal sense, dependent on the presence of another person just to put on her own clothing. The corset, the buttons, the hooks and eyes, all of it conspired to make solitude impractical. And solitude, it turns out, was one of the things these women wanted most. The corset deserves its own consideration. The fashionable silhouette of the 1880s required a waist that was, by any reasonable physiological standard, too small. The effect was produced not by the woman's natural body but by years of wearing progressively tighter lacing from girlhood, supplemented by the determined application of the laces each morning. The women who wore these corsets became, over time, genuinely dependent on them, their abdominal muscles, having been replaced functionally by the boning and lacing of the garment, could no longer support an upright posture without its assistance. A woman who had been corseted since the age of 12 was, in her early 20s, physically unable to sit up straight without external support. This was not incidental. This was, in some deep structural sense, the point. The corset made weakness into fashion. It made dependence into elegance. A woman who could not breathe deeply was a woman who could not exert herself physically, could not raise her voice, could not sustain the kind of effort that strong emotion requires. She was designed, literally designed by the garment she wore, for the gentle indoors life, for calls and teas and carriage rides and long dinners, and against the kind of life that required anything more strenuous. The corset was the architecture of constraint made textile. Once dressed, the morning had its routines. Breakfast was taken downstairs formally at a set table, even when the husband was travelling and the children were in the nursery, and there was no one to eat with but a companion or a governess. The silver and china were laid correctly. The coffee was served in a silver pot. There were flowers in the centre of the table, changed daily. To eat a meal from a simple tray in one's own room was a sign of illness, or eccentricity, or the kind of domestic disorder that reflected badly on the household as a whole. After breakfast, correspondence. A society woman in the Gilded Age maintained a correspondence that would exhaust a professional secretary. There were letters to write, accepting invitations and declining invitations and asking for the details of invitations not yet properly received. There were thank you notes for dinner parties attended the previous week. There were notes to the florist, the dressmaker, the caterer, the woman organising the charity bazaar. The form of these letters was as regulated as everything else. The correct paper, the correct ink, the correct salutation for each rank of acquaintance. To write a letter that was too familiar to someone of higher social standing was an error that would be discussed. To write one that was too formal to someone of lower standing was a slight that would be remembered. The stationery alone required attention. Correct mourning stationery, the paper bordered in black, the depth of the border indicating the degree of the relationship to the deceased and the number of the month since the death, was one of the elaborate systems that governed correspondence. A woman who miscalculated the width of the mourning border on her writing paper was communicating something unintentional, something that might be remarked upon by the people who received her letters, who would notice, because they had been trained to notice, the small signals in every communication. Then came the calls. Paying calls was perhaps the single most time-consuming and most rigidly ritualized of all the social obligations these women carried. You visited a set list of houses in a prescribed order. You stayed a prescribed length of time. 15 minutes was correct for a formal call, 30 for an intimate friend. You sat in the drawing room and discussed the correct subjects in the correct manner, and then you left a card, and the card was placed in the card dish, and later that week you would receive a return call, and the whole machinery would turn again. Ward McAllister, who was Mrs. Astor's social advisor and the man who codified the unwritten rules of the 400 into something approaching an actual system, once observed that the social obligations of a woman in Mrs. Astor's circle could occupy every waking hour if she allowed them to. Most women allowed them to. Most women had no choice. The cards themselves were a social text. Your calling card announced your name, your husband's name, your address. It was left face down or face up depending on whether you wished to convey that you had paid a call in person or merely sent a card by footman. The card turned up at the corner indicated the intention to honour the entire family with the call, not merely its mistress. The card left in the card dish of someone you had called upon but found absent was a communication in itself. You had fulfilled the obligation, the call had been made, the record was established. The social ledger was credited accordingly. Caroline Astor herself, the queen of this entire elaborate world, was reported to receive as many as 60 callers on her Monday afternoon at Holmes. She sat in her ballroom beneath a life-size portrait of herself in full evening regalia and welcomed each caller for precisely the allotted time. She could perform this duty for 4 or 5 hours without appearing tired. It was, her contemporaries agreed, an extraordinary performance. They meant it as a compliment. They did not question whether there might be something wearing about spending your afternoons as a living exhibit in your own museum. The evenings were no less structured. Dinner parties began at 8 and lasted until 11 or midnight, with 7 or 8 courses and conversation that was expected to be witty without being controversial, learned without being pedantic, warm without being improper. After dinner the men went to the library and the women went to the drawing room, and this separation lasted approximately 45 minutes, and then everyone came together again for music and cards, and eventually the long business of departure, during which carriages were called and wraps were found, and a woman might stand in a draughty hall for 20 minutes while her host and hostess said farewell to 40 people in the order the carriage had arrived. The dinner party required its own specific performance. Seating was arranged by the hostess according to rules of rank and compatibility that were not written anywhere but were understood perfectly. You sat where you were placed. You spoke to the person on your right during the first course, the person on your left during the subsequent ones. You did not discuss money or religion or politics or illness. You were amusing if you could manage it, and interested if you could not manage amusing and pleasant as a minimum. The hostess watched. She was always watching. And then home, and then undressing, with the maid's help because the hooks required it, and then bed in a room that was perhaps the most genuinely private space a wealthy woman could claim, though even this was not entirely free of intrusion. The maid came in the morning. The children came on Sunday afternoons. The husband, if the marriage was that kind of marriage, came when he chose. But in the hours between, say, midnight and 7 in the morning, a woman in her own bedroom was briefly genuinely alone. It was in these hours that many of them thought their truest thoughts. It was in these hours that some of them made their plans. And it was in these hours, sitting at the small writing desk near the window, with the city quiet below and the rest of the house asleep, that the idea sometimes arrived. The idea that was, by any reasonable standard of Gilded Age propriety, unthinkable. What if I could be somewhere else tomorrow? What if someone else could be me? The thought came softly, the way the best thoughts come, not announced, not dramatic, but arriving the way dawn arrives, gradually, almost without your noticing, until the room is full of a different light. It did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way most ideas do, first as a small, vague discomfort. He sensed that something in the arrangement of her days was not quite right. Then, as a question, asked privately in the dark, why does every hour belong to someone else? Then, more specifically, what if 1 hour could be different? What if, for one Tuesday afternoon, the life continued without her in it, and she continued somewhere outside of it, and neither the life nor she were any the worse for the arrangement? The idea was so outrageous that it required a period of careful not thinking before it could be approached directly. She circled it, as you circle a hot thing before she was ready to touch it. Across the city, in a different kind of room entirely, a dressing room backstage at Wallack's Theatre on Broadway, or in the green room of the Casino Theatre on 39th Street, or in the cramped upstairs parlour of a boarding house on Bleecker Street where several actresses shared rooms to keep costs manageable. Another kind of woman was also awake at midnight. She was awake because the curtain had come down only an hour before, and the energy of performance takes longer to leave the body than most people imagine. She was sitting at a mirror surrounded by small gas jets, removing the heavy theatrical makeup that in 1887 was made partly of lead oxide and smelled faintly of turpentine. She was tired in a specific way, the tired that comes from pretending to be someone else for 3 hours, from holding another person's emotions in your own body until the final curtain. The word actress in the Gilded Age carried a complicated freight. On the one hand, the legitimate theatre had become increasingly respectable over the preceding 2 decades, and the great actresses of the period, women like Helena Modjeska, Clara Morris, Fanny Davenport, Ada Rehan, were celebrated figures who moved in relatively elevated social circles and were treated as artists of consequence. Mrs. Patrick Campbell, visiting from London, could expect to dine with the finest families. Sarah Bernhardt, on her American tours, was received as a kind of royalty. The newspapers covered theatrical stars with the same breathless attention they gave to society women, and sometimes with more genuine interest. On the other hand, an actress was still, in the eyes of the purer stratum of Gilded Age society, a working woman. She sold her presence. She performed for money. She was seen by strangers. These facts placed her in an entirely different category from the wives and daughters of the wealthy, whose presence was restricted, whose bodies were covered by 7 layers of expensive fabric, whose visibility was managed with extraordinary care. The actress was visible in a way the society woman was not permitted to be. She spoke lines written by others, but she spoke them in her own voice, to a room full of people who had chosen to be there and who would applaud or sit in silence depending on what she gave them. There was a kind of freedom in this that was both admired and feared. The fear was real and had a specific shape. An actress could be seen. This seems like a tautology, but it is not. To be seen, to be looked at by strangers, to be evaluated by eyes that had no social relationship with you, to be desired or disliked or simply observed by people who owed you no courtesy, was a state that wealthy women were protected from with enormous care. A respectable woman was seen only by people who knew her, only in contexts that were managed and supervised. The actress stood on a stage and was seen by everyone. This was transgressive in a way that is hard to recover the full weight of from our current position, but which the women of the 1880s felt as almost physical. Lillian Russell was the great beauty of the period, dark-eyed, full-figured, possessed of a soprano voice that seemed to fill not just the theatre, but the entire block. She was known by nearly everyone in New York, including a great many women who could not have acknowledged knowing her in public. Diamond Jim Brady gave her a jewelled bicycle. The papers reported it. Everyone read the papers. The women who read about Lillian Russell in the society columns, who was she seen with? What was she wearing? Where had she been? Read with a complexity of feeling that was not quite admiration and not quite condemnation, but something that contained elements of both, with something else underneath that neither word quite captures. What the papers covered less, because it was more difficult to document and because it involved people who had reasons not to be documented, was the traffic in the other direction. The society woman who was drawn toward the theatrical world, the wife of a banker who attended the theatre not in her box with her husband and her pearls, but in the orchestra seats, wearing a simpler dress and a different name. The woman who found reasons to call on a dressmaker who happened to be located a block from a theatre, and who sometimes, in the time between the fitting and the carriage's return, slipped through a stage door and sat in a warm, dark space and watched people pretend to be other people, and felt, for an hour, something she could not quite name. The theatrical world and the social world occupied the same city blocks in ways that made crossing between them both easy and fraught. The theatres of the 1880s were clustered along Broadway in the 20s and 30s, neighbourhoods that were close enough to Fifth Avenue to be convenient and far enough to be, in the social geography of the wealthy, slightly elsewhere. The restaurants that served theatre audiences, Rector's, Shanley's, the late-night establishments where performers gathered after the curtain came down, were not the restaurants where society dined officially, but they were not inaccessible. A woman who wished to be in them could find a way. The actresses themselves were aware of this interest. They were perceptive women, necessarily. Their work required them to read people, to understand emotional states, to recognise pretense. And they could see, when a woman in an expensive walking dress lingered a little too long at the stage door, or when a carefully worded note arrived with a return address in the East 60s, that something more than ordinary admiration was in play, something more like recognition. Two kinds of performance artist, encountering each other across a social divide, each slightly surprised by what the other could see in her. The connections that developed were various. Some were friendships, genuine and lasting, conducted in the carefully private way that unconventional friendships required in that era. Some were professional arrangements. A society woman might commission an actress to teach her or her daughter's elocution, a respectable enough transaction that required multiple visits, and could justify correspondence. An actress might be hired to perform at a private entertainment, a birthday party, a charity evening. And this too required meetings and fittings and conversations, the kind of conversations that could, if both parties were willing, drift into different territory. The theatrical boarding houses of the period were places where the city's rules were slightly loosened. In a respectable boarding house near the theatre district, women of different classes and different professions shared communal spaces, the parlour, the dining room, the small back garden, in ways that the rest of the city would not have permitted. A lady's companion down on her luck might share a parlour with a chorus girl. A music teacher might sit at dinner next to a comic actress who was better paid than either of them. The mixing was not scandalous in itself. Boarding houses were respectable establishments, carefully managed, but it produced conversations that could not have happened in the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue, conversations about work and money and what it meant to be a woman in a city that had very different plans for different kinds of women. And in some cases, not many, but enough to constitute a pattern, the arrangement between a society woman and an actress was something more specific, more functional, the sort of thing that required a careful transfer of information. Which chair you sit in at Mrs. Vanderbilt's teas, how long you wait before rising after the hostess rises, what you say to the person on your right at dinner if he's a bore, and what you say if he's interesting. The colour of your eyes, the set of your shoulders, the way you tilt your head when you're pretending to listen. These are not qualities that can be communicated in a letter. They require practice. They require a willing student and a patient teacher. They require, in short, a woman who is an actress by profession, and a woman who needs, for reasons she may not fully articulate even to herself, to be elsewhere for an afternoon. The theatre world understood transactions. It understood that services had prices, that discretion had value, that a sealed envelope left on a dressing table was a cleaner arrangement than a conversation. The women who worked in the theatrical world had seen a great deal, and most of what they had seen had confirmed their sense that the grand edifice of respectable society was, at its foundations, built on precisely the same material as a stage set: good craftsmanship, good lighting, and an audience willing to believe. They were not wrong. The gaslight that illuminated the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue and the gaslight that illuminated the stages of Broadway were the same gas, burning from the same pipes, casting the same quality of warm, wavering light. The difference was only in the intention of the performance and in who was permitted to watch. There is a particular quality of darkness in an empty theatre. If you have ever sat in one, and perhaps you have on a school trip or a visit before a show, the stage lit and the seats empty, the echo of the space palpable, you know that it is different from ordinary darkness. It has depth to it. It has the accumulated presence of all the performances that have taken place in it. The air in an empty theatre holds something. The actresses who worked in these spaces knew this, and they moved through that darkness with the comfort of people who are at home in it. You're in your own darkness now. The warm, personal darkness of a room at rest, a body at rest, a mind that has begun to let go of the things it was holding. This darkness is yours. It has depth and warmth, and the particular quality of a space that knows you are here. Let it hold you. You are already somewhere good. The city continued below the theatres, below the boarding houses, below the great mansions, below everything. The rivers ran at its edges, the harbour lay at its foot. And in the two worlds we have been describing, the world of the drawing room and the world of the dressing room, women were moving through their evenings in ways that sometimes converged, and in that convergence, making something that neither world would have designed on its own. The first problem was resemblance. A substitute could not simply be any woman who was willing. She had to be someone who could plausibly inhabit your life, at least from a middle distance, at least for an afternoon. The society world operated on recognition. Mrs. Astor's footman knew the face of every regular caller. The head steward at Delmonico's knew which table belonged to which family. The woman who came 3 times a week to lead the children's French lessons had been with the household for 6 years. You could not insert a stranger into this world without detection, unless the stranger was skilled enough at insertion that she passed inspection at every level. The resemblance required was not precise. Twins are not what this arrangement demanded. What was needed was a woman of roughly the same age, roughly the same height and colouring, who could, once dressed in the correct clothes and taught the correct posture and manner, pass as the original from across a room or across the dinner table in the particular kind of social light. The candlelight, the gaslight, the light that fell through cathedral windows at charity events. That was always, in that world, a little forgiving of detail. This forgiving quality of Gilded Age social light is worth dwelling on. The rooms in which the wealthy entertained were not brightly lit by modern standards. The gaslight was warm and yellow and cast deep shadows. The candelabra on the dinner table illuminated the plates and the silver and the flowers, but left the faces of the people at the far end of the table in a flattering dimness. The parlours where afternoon calls were received had their curtains half drawn against the harsh afternoon light. The opera box was lit by footlights and house chandeliers, but from a distance. In all these contexts, an observer who was not in intimate proximity was working from general impression rather than precise detail. This was a structural feature of the social world, not an accidental one. The search for a suitable substitute was itself a delicate operation. You could not advertise. You could not ask directly, not at first. What you could do was attend the theatre with a different quality of attention than usual, not watching the production, exactly, but watching the performers as individuals, watching how this one held her body when she walked, watching how that one managed her hands, watching especially the women who played society roles, because the good ones had studied the originals closely. They had observed wealthy women with the same careful eye that wealthy women were not permitted to observe them with. The performance was a kind of mirror, if you knew where to look. The society roles in theatre of the period required a specific kind of physical vocabulary. An actress playing a wealthy woman in a drawing-room comedy of the 1880s had to know how to sit in a way that conveyed that she had never been taught to sit because the genuinely wealthy appeared utterly unconscious of their posture, while in fact managing it with constant practice. She had to know how to hold a teacup, not grasping the handle but touching it with a kind of casual possession, the handle familiar to the hand in the way that objects you have handled your whole life are familiar. She had to know how to receive a compliment without seeming pleased, and how to deliver a snub without seeming rude. These skills were studied, rehearsed, perfected, and in a woman who had done this work well and repeatedly, they became genuine, performed so many times that they were no longer distinguishable from natural. There were women who made a small specialty of this kind of private work in theatrical New York. They were not famous. The work required discretion, and discretion and fame are incompatible. But within certain circles among the network of dressmakers and social secretaries and the women who organised the private musicals that were the slightly more informal alternative to formal balls, their names were known. If you needed a woman who could attend a charity tea in your place while you were absent with a diplomatic headache, there was a name that might be whispered. A meeting could be arranged. The dressmakers were often the intermediaries. This makes a kind of sense. They occupied a position that gave them access to both worlds. A fashionable dressmaker on 23rd Street served wealthy clients who came to her establishment for fittings, and she also knew the theatrical world because actresses needed their costumes made and altered and repaired, and the skills required were the same. She was, in the most practical sense, a woman who dressed women of every kind, who understood that a dress on a body is an argument, and that the argument it makes changes depending on the body and the occasion and the audience. The first meetings between the society woman and the potential substitute were always careful. They took place in neutral settings, a dressmaker's back room, a tea shop on a side street, a small hotel where neither party was known. The society woman would arrive in a plain carriage, wearing less jewellery than usual. The actress would arrive without the particular alertness that she wore in professional settings, the practised attention to audience. They would sit across a small table and tea would be brought, and for a while they would talk about nothing consequential, the weather, the current exhibitions, some recent theatrical event that provided neutral ground, while each assessed the other. What the society woman was assessing was this. Was this woman discreet, not just willing to keep secrets, everyone claimed willingness, but genuinely capable of it? Did she understand that the arrangement they were about to discuss existed nowhere in writing and would never be spoken of outside this room and one or two others like it? And was she perceptive enough, observant enough, skilled enough in the craft of impersonation that she could actually perform what was being asked of her? What the actress was assessing, was this woman reliable? Would she pay what was agreed? Would she maintain her part of the arrangement, appearing at the right time, in the right place, with the right story prepared? Would she, if something went wrong, handle it with the composure her breeding supposedly guaranteed? Or would she panic and create a situation that would bring trouble on them both? These mutual assessments took time. The first meeting rarely produced an agreement. It produced a more specific second meeting, and sometimes a third, by which time each woman had formed a view of the other's judgment and capability that was close enough to confidence to proceed. The decision to proceed was not made verbally, usually. It was made in the way that decisions are sometimes made between people who have agreed not to speak directly, through a slight adjustment in the quality of the conversation, a movement from the neutral toward the specific, a question asked that would not be asked unless the answer was already expected. The sums involved varied. For a single afternoon, an appearance at a charity meeting, a brief call at one or two houses, a turn in the carriage in Central Park that fulfilled a social obligation without requiring much conversation, the fee might be $20, which was significant money in 1887. A labourer earned perhaps $8 a week. A schoolteacher might earn $30 a month. $20 for an afternoon was payment that acknowledged the risk involved and the skill required. For longer engagements, several days at Newport, attendance at a series of events during the season, The arrangements were more complex and the fees correspondingly higher. The actress, having accepted, entered a period of preparation that was in some ways more demanding than preparing for a stage role. A stage role has a script. The rules are established by the playwright and the director. You know your lines, your blocking, your cues. The role of Mrs. So-and-so at the afternoon tea had no script. The dialogue was improvised from a set of general principles about what a woman of this station said and how she said it, supplemented by specific instructions. Mrs. Fairley always laughs at Mr. Pemberton's stories even when they are not funny, because his wife is watching. Never discuss the Ashfords with the Warburtons. If Mrs. Delancey asks about the summer plans, say only that we have not yet decided. The preparation involved observation as well as instruction. The actress might spend an afternoon near the park or on Lower Fifth Avenue simply watching how women of this station walked, how they managed their skirts and their parasols, how they acknowledged acquaintances at different distances and of different ranks. She watched carriages pass and noted the quality of stillness in the women inside them, the way they sat without appearing to be sitting in any particular way, the way they turned their heads at the precisely correct degree of interest without looking too eager or too indifferent. This was information that could be imitated. It was, after all, already a performance. The question was whether she could perform the performance convincingly enough that no one watching could see the difference. The clothes were crucial. A substitute could not simply wear her own dress. She wore the original's dress, often brought to her a day or two before, altered by the household dressmaker if necessary, returned afterward as if it had merely been at the tailor for adjustment. The pearls were real, which added an anxiety neither party entirely managed to suppress. The accessories, the particular fan, the specific gloves, the little bag with its silver clasp, were loaned with instructions and returned with the same care. Some maids were in on the arrangement. Some maids were, in fact, the architects of it, the trusted intermediate through whom the message was carried, and the actress was first contacted and the details were handled. The relationship between a society woman and her lady's maid was, in many households, the most intimate relationship in the woman's life. The maid knew things no one else knew. She had seen her mistress cry. She had heard things said in the dark that were never said in daylight. If the maid chose to help, the arrangement became considerably easier. The night before the first substitution was, for the real woman, a particular kind of sleepless night. Not the anxious sleeplessness of dread, but the alert sleeplessness of something that has not yet been named. A feeling somewhere between excitement and terror, the feeling of standing at the edge of something. The lamp burned. The city made its sounds below. Tomorrow, someone else would be her. She lay in the dark and thought about this. Someone else would be her. The idea was so strange that it required examination from multiple angles, the way a new piece of furniture requires moving around to see from different positions. She was the same person she had always been. The arrangements would be made or not made. The world would continue. And yet something was changing, had already changed, in the simple fact of the plan's existence. She had discovered, in the making of the plan, that her life had edges. And where there are edges, there are also, by definition, things beyond the edges. The morning of the substitution arrived like any other morning. Coffee smell and coal smoke and the sound of the city beginning its business below the windows. But for the woman who was preparing to step aside from her own life, even temporarily, it was not quite like any other morning. She moved through the familiar routines with the particular careful attention of someone who knows they are doing something for the last time for a while, the way you touch a door frame when you are leaving a house you love. The breakfast was the same breakfast it always was, the silver pot of coffee, the toast in its rack, the morning paper folded on the plate. But she read the paper differently this morning, or rather, she did not quite read it. She held it, and her eyes moved over the columns, and some of it entered her in the ordinary way, but some of the attention that usually went to the paper was elsewhere, rehearsing. Going over the instructions she had given, and the instructions she had received in either direction, checking that nothing had been forgotten. The actress arrived by a back entrance, or through the servants' door, or through the arrangement of the household dressmaker's visits, which provided a plausible cover for a woman coming in carrying clothing. She arrived already transformed in the small preliminary ways, her hair dressed in the appropriate style, her manner composed in the particular posture that long practice had associated with a woman of this station. But the final transformation happened in the room upstairs, with the real woman's maid attending, if the maid was trusted, or with the real woman herself doing the fastening and adjusting and the final, quiet inventory. The two women stood in the room together. One was preparing to become the other. The transformation was not magic, and it was not seamless. There were always small details that required adjustment, always a moment when the difference between the two women was visible in some way that neither could ignore. But the transformation was real enough for the purpose, and the purpose was specific: to pass at middle distance in filtered light for a finite period of time as a woman who was not present. The instructions passed between them in low voices, not whispered, because whispers carry oddly, but spoken in the register of conversation that is meant to be complete when it leaves the room. Stand here. Turn. The light in this room is different from stage light. You will need to be slower. There is no back of the house to project to. Everything happens at close range. When Mrs. Pemberton speaks to you about her daughter's engagement, listen for longer than feels natural. She wants to be heard, not answered. When you take tea, use the small spoon, not the large one. When you leave, do not forget to admire the new arrangement in the south parlour. She expects it to be remarked upon. The instructions were absorbed, the dress was fastened, the pearls were clasped, the gloves were drawn on with a slowness that the real owner of those gloves had never observed. She had put them on every day for years without thinking about how they felt, but the actress felt them on someone else's hands and knew the sensation of inhabiting a life you had not grown up in. The gloves were kid, white, buttoned at the wrist with a single small button. They smelled of the sachet in the drawer where they were kept. Orris root and something dry and sweet, the particular smell of a careful household. And then the real woman left. She left through the back, or in a hired carriage, or sometimes simply on foot, wearing something plain enough to be unremarkable. The city in 1887 was large enough that a woman could be invisible in it if she chose to be, if she wore the right clothes and avoided the neighbourhoods where she was known. The streets of the Lower West Side, or the blocks around Washington Square, or the particular network of streets in the 30s where studios and theatres and boarding houses and small tea shops created a different kind of social geography. In these places, a woman without her jewellery and her carriage and her calling cards was simply a woman. The feeling of this simplicity, of being simply a woman, without the social architecture that normally surrounded her, was itself a form of experience worth paying $20 for. She could walk without purpose. She could stop at a shop window without being identified as someone who should be shopping at a better shop with a maid attending. She could look at strangers. She could be looked at as a stranger, which was different from being looked at as a person of consequence, which was what she always was in the neighbourhoods where she was known. Meanwhile, the substitute was at work, calling cards in hand, a detail that required some prior arrangement since the engraved cards were the property of the household and had to be removed and returned without the butler noticing a discrepancy in the count. The carriage had been ordered. The coachman, if he was not in on the arrangement, simply drove where he was directed. Many coachmen, truth be told, had developed opinions about this kind of thing that they kept to themselves. They were paid well. They had seen things. The afternoon calls were the most common venue for substitution. An afternoon call in the Gilded Age lasted 15 minutes and followed a script almost as rigid as any theatrical one. You arrived, you were announced, you were received in the morning room or the drawing room, depending on the intimacy of the relationship. You sat, you accepted or declined tea, you discussed the weather, the coming event, the mutual acquaintance whose health was currently a topic. You rose at the correct moment, you left your card, you departed. The hostess, if she was gracious, accompanied you to the hall. The whole transaction could be completed successfully by a woman who knew the form and had been properly briefed on the content without requiring any particular depth of personal knowledge. The art was in the listening. The substitute had been trained through her profession to listen actively in a way that most people do not. When you listen actively, when you're genuinely attending to what the other person is saying, tracking not just the words but the emotional register, the needs embedded in the communication, the things being said underneath the things being said, the other person feels heard in a way that is quite different from the ordinary listening of social conversation. They may not know why the interaction felt unusually satisfying. They may simply register a vague sense that they had been particularly good company today, that the conversation had gone particularly well. Some of the women who received the substitute's calls commented afterward to mutual friends that they had found the real woman in unusually good form lately. more attentive than usual, more genuinely present. There was an irony here that was not lost on the real woman when these comments were relayed to her. The version of herself that was most praised by her social circle was the version performed by someone else. The challenges arose at the edges: unexpected encounters, a relative who had not been warned, a friend who was more intimate than the briefing had accounted for, a hostess who decided, on this of all afternoons, to ask a question that required specific memory rather than general performance. It was in these moments that the substitute's craft was most severely tested, and it was in these moments that she fell back on the oldest tool of the theatrical profession. She listened. She allowed the other person to fill the silence. She asked questions that redirected the conversation. She introduced a subject that she knew, from her briefing, the hostess was eager to discuss. There were moments of unexpected pleasure too. The substitute, moving through a world that was not her own, sometimes noticed things that the woman who had always lived there had stopped seeing. The particular quality of the light in Mrs. Livingston's front parlour, which fell through bevelled glass at this time of day and made small rainbows on the white moulding. The smell of the jasmine in the conservatory of the house on 72nd Street, which was extraordinary, and which the house's owner had long since ceased to notice. These observations she kept. They were hers. The afternoon passed. Tea was taken. Calls were made and returned. The correct things were said. The pearls caught the light appropriately. The gloves came off and went on again at the right moments. And then it was over, and the carriage returned, and the actress climbed the back stairs one more time, and the pearls and the gloves came off, and the borrowed dress was carefully returned to its hook, and two women stood in a room, in the last light of the afternoon, and looked at each other with the slightly dazed expression of people who have just accomplished something that should not have been possible. There was always a debrief, not a formal one, not a meeting with an agenda and notes, but a quiet exchange, over the small cup of tea that the real woman offered the actress before the latter left, in which the afternoon was reconstructed in enough detail for the real woman to know what had happened in her name while she was elsewhere. Names mentioned, topics raised, any anomalies, any moments of difficulty, any compliments delivered or received. The actress gave this account with professional accuracy and without embellishment. The real woman listened, and filed the information, and was ready by the following day to respond appropriately to whatever the afternoon had put in motion. The real woman returned to her life, the actress returned to hers. And somewhere in the city, in whatever small, specific place the afternoon's freedom had been spent, the memory of it was already settling into the kind of quiet, durable warmth that certain experiences leave behind, the kind that can be returned to, in the dark, years later, and still found intact. The first arrangement was always the most difficult. The second was where both women began to understand what they had made. By the third and fourth, the system had developed its own small rhythms. The timing of the carriage, the usual room for the changing, the particular order in which the briefing was given and received. Ritual has a way of making the impossible feel ordinary, and this was no different. What had seemed, at the outset, like a transgression with the quality of a held breath became simply the thing that happened on certain Tuesday afternoons, regular as the visits to the dressmaker, unremarkable to anyone who was not looking closely. What the actress brought to the arrangement beyond her skill at performance was a body of knowledge that the society woman did not possess. A professional's understanding of how observation actually works. On stage, an actress learned to understand the difference between what audiences saw and what was actually being presented. That audiences saw what they expected to see, filling in the gaps in the performance with their own assumptions, creating the full picture from the partial one. The watcher, in other words, was always complicit in the watching. They wanted to see what they came to see, and they collaborated unconsciously in the production of it. This principle, transferred to the social world of afternoon calls and opera boxes and carriage drives, explained something that had always seemed puzzling about how the arrangements could possibly succeed. It was not that the substitute was so perfect that no one could tell the difference. It was that almost no one was really looking. Social encounters of this kind were managed by script, and once the script was in motion, the participants attended to the script rather than to the performer. They heard what they expected to hear. They registered the correct dress, the correct posture, the correct small gestures of social ease, and having registered these, they processed the interaction as completed and moved on. The cases where this failed, where someone looked more closely, attended to the specific quality of the presence rather than its general correctness, were the cases that required the deepest reserves of the substitute's craft. But these cases were rarer than anyone planning the arrangement would have predicted, because people attending afternoon calls were, as a rule, attending to their own performance at least as much as to the performance across from them. Both parties were managing appearances. The management of appearances, when done well, produced a kind of mutual inattention that was, paradoxically, what made the social world run smoothly. There was a lesson in this that the society woman carried with her back into the ordinary conduct of her social life. She had spent years in a state of mild anxiety about whether her performance was convincing, whether the surface she presented was adequate, whether someone might somehow see through to the various things that lay behind it, the exhaustion, the constraint, the occasional furious wish to be anywhere else. The arrangements taught her that the anxiety was largely unnecessary. People were not looking that carefully. They did not want to see through the surface. They wanted the surface to hold, because it made their own lives simpler. The performance was a mutual agreement, not a test she was perpetually at risk of failing. Understanding this did not free her from the performance. The performance was still required, the calls were still made, the cards were still left. The evenings at the opera still required the correct dress and the correct expression, and the correct commentary offered to the correct people at the correct moments of the interval. But she moved through all of this with a slightly different quality of ease. Not the ease of someone who had stopped caring, but the ease of someone who understood the structure they were moving inside, who could see the frame as well as the picture. It was a small freedom, but it was real, and it was hers, and she had paid for it in the most interesting way available to her. The question that matters most is not how they escaped, but where they went. What did a woman do with an afternoon, or a day, or in the most elaborate arrangements several consecutive days, of freedom that no one knew she had? This is where the story opens out into something richer and more complicated than the simple mechanics of impersonation, because the answers were as various as the women themselves, and they tell us something about what these women were actually longing for beneath the performance of their lives. Some went to the suffrage meetings. By the 1880s, the women's suffrage movement had organizations in most American cities, and while the public associations were dominated by working women and women from the professional middle class, there were wealthy women who were drawn to the cause but could not openly attend without inviting the kind of social consequences that still made them hesitate. The meetings were held in parlours and church halls, and in these rooms women spoke at length and with passion about things that were never discussed at dinner parties: the right to property, the right to vote, the right to exist in law as a person rather than a dependent. The suffrage meetings of the 1880s were not the triumphant gatherings of a movement approaching victory. They were the quieter meetings of a movement that had been fighting for decades and still could not see the end. The women who attended had to believe, on evidence that was sometimes thin, that the work they were doing would eventually produce a result. They had to believe this in the face of ridicule from the press, opposition from their own social circles, and the argument constantly made that women who wanted to vote were either unnatural or confused about what was good for them. To attend these meetings required a particular kind of stubbornness, the kind that is not dramatic but simply continues. A woman who had arranged for someone else to attend Mrs. Van Cortlandt's Thursday at home in her place might spend that Thursday afternoon in a church hall on West 23rd Street, sitting in a wooden chair and listening to a woman in a plain dress explain the legal mechanisms by which a married woman in New York could not sign a contract in her own name, could not control her own earnings, could not retain custody of her children in a divorce without her husband's agreement. The information was not new to her. She lived it. But hearing it spoken aloud, in a room full of women who also lived it, was a different experience from knowing it privately. Knowledge that is held alone is heavy in one way. Knowledge that is held collectively is heavy in a different way, and also lighter. The New York Society for Woman Suffrage had been organised since the 1870s, and its membership records show women from a variety of backgrounds. But the records are incomplete in the way that records of politically sensitive organisations are often incomplete. Names that might be embarrassing are absent, attendance that might compromise social standing is not documented, and the full picture of who was in those rooms on which afternoons is not recoverable. What can be said is that the funding of the organisation, like the funding of most suffrage organisations in this period, was partly provided by wealthy donors who were not necessarily publicly associated with the cause. Some women went to studios. The art world of Gilded Age New York was, in certain pockets, considerably more permissive than the social world. Studios in the West, 20s and 30s, in the neighbourhoods where painters and sculptors and illustrators lived and worked, were places where different rules applied. Women could sit for portraits in comfortable rather than formal clothes. Women could look at paintings that depicted subjects the parlour would not have admitted. Women could talk to men who had opinions about things other than railroads and politics, men who were interested in what they thought, a novelty that was, for some of these women, genuinely disorienting. John Singer Sargent, who painted many of the era's great beauties and socialites in their official capacity, also painted women in informal settings, women in boats, women in gardens, women in motion. His portraits captured something that the formal commissions often missed: the sense of a person existing in their own right, the quality of a mind behind the face, a woman who sat for Sargent in an informal session, not the great official portrait that would hang in the drawing room, but a small study, a sketch, something never intended for public display, might find herself held in a different kind of attention than she was accustomed to, the attention of someone who was interested in what was actually there. The small sketch done in an informal session was a different object from the official portrait. The official portrait was public. It would be seen by everyone who entered the drawing room, assessed and commented on, compared to the subject's actual appearance, and found accurate or flattering or unflattering as the case might be. It was part of the household's presentation to the world. The small sketch was private. It could be kept in a portfolio that no one else opened, looked at in moments of privacy, held as evidence of an hour that was genuinely the woman's own. Some women went to music, not the opera, which was a social event as much as an artistic one, thick with surveillance and protocol. They went to the small concert halls, the recital rooms, the places where a pianist played for an audience of 40, and you sat close enough to see the performer's hands and feel the sound move through the air rather than across a vast, jewelled room. They went to hear music in the way music is meant to be heard, not as an occasion, but as an experience. Sitting in a plain wooden seat in a coat rather than an evening gown with no one watching their reactions, they could let the music do what music does when nothing is required of you in return. The capacity of music to provide cover for genuine feeling was something the Gilded Age understood and used, but only in specific contexts. At the opera, you sat in your box and were seen hearing music, and what you were seen to feel was managed accordingly. At a small recital, in a room of 40 people, the social compact was slightly different. There was still the requirement of decorum, of appropriate response. But the scale was smaller, the observation was less complete, and the music, particularly the piano music of the period, Chopin, Schumann, Schubert, was designed to produce interior states that the public face could not entirely suppress. Some women went to people, a lover in some cases, but this was riskier than the other options, required more planning, produced more anxiety, and was the explanation that contemporary observers were always most ready to assume, which meant it attracted the most suspicion. The arrangements were elaborate. Letters passed through trusted third parties, meetings at houses in unfashionable neighbourhoods, a system of times and signals worked out in advance and changed regularly. The risk of a lover was not only the risk of discovery, it was the risk of creating another obligation, another performance, another set of requirements that had to be managed. A love affair in the Gilded Age was not simple even when it was secret, or perhaps especially when it was secret, because everything that could not be done publicly had to be done in the compressed, overloaded space of the private hours, and the compression produced its own kind of intensity that was not always entirely pleasurable. And some simply went to be alone. This is perhaps the most unexpected destination, that a woman who had servants and a household and a social calendar and a husband might spend her hard-won hours of freedom doing nothing more dramatic than sitting quietly by herself in a hired room, or walking in a park without a chaperone, or eating a simple meal at a small table near a window and watching the street. The hunger for solitude, genuine and unperformed solitude, was something these women almost never spoke of directly. It was too easy to misunderstand. It sounded like unhappiness, and they were not unhappy, or not only unhappy. They were simply, after years of living entirely in public, in need of the experience of their own private company. A hired room in a boarding house on a quiet block in Greenwich Village, a small table, a cup of tea and something to read, the particular silence of a room where no one is waiting for you. For a few hours, for an afternoon or a day, This was the secret life. Not passion, not rebellion, just the unremarkable, precious experience of existing outside the frame that everyone else used to see you. They returned, of course. They always returned. The carriage came at the agreed time, or the walk took them back to the familiar blocks, and the city reorganized itself into the version they lived in daily, the version where their name meant something specific and their presence was expected. And the silver dish in the hall already contained the calling cards of people who had come to see them while they were not there. They returned and they stepped back into the life that waited for them. But they carried the hours with them, folded away like a letter you have read many times, kept in a place that is only yours. There is a particular quality to remembered freedom. It is different from anticipated freedom, which is bright and restless and makes the present harder to bear. Remembered freedom is quieter. It is the knowledge that something happened, that it was real, that it left a mark. It does not promise that it will happen again. It simply asserts that it happened once, and that once is not nothing, and that the person who experienced it carries the experience as a form of evidence about what is possible. These women went home. They resumed their pearls and their calling cards and their 7-course dinners and their careful letters on the correct paper with the correct width black border. They resumed their lives. But the resumption was different, in some quality that did not show from the outside from what it would have been if the afternoon had not happened. They were themselves again. They were also slightly more themselves. The hours outside the performance had a texture that was entirely their own. Not the texture of leisure. Leisure in the Gilded Age was itself a performance, with its prescribed activities and social contexts, and the constant awareness of being seen having leisure in the correct way. What these women were after was something without a social category, something the period did not have a name for because it had not quite conceived of it as a thing a woman might need, time that was answerable to no one. A woman who walked alone on the lower streets of the city on a Thursday afternoon in November 1889 was walking in a world that was fully real, in the sense of being unmanaged. The cold came from the actual sky. The smell of roasting chestnuts from the cart on the corner came from actual chestnuts. The voices around her, the vendors, the children, the conversations between people who did not know she was there, were not adjusted for her presence. The city did not perform itself for her. It was simply going on, as it did, indifferent and continuous and alive in the way that only things indifferent to you can be fully alive. This quality of indifference was, paradoxically, what made the freedom feel like freedom. She was accustomed to being attended to entering rooms that adjusted around her, to conversations that were calibrated to her position, to a social world that was, in every meaningful sense, oriented toward her. But oriented toward her as a position, as a name, as a representative of a particular household and a particular level of the social hierarchy. The city on a November afternoon, by contrast, was oriented toward nothing in particular. It was simply proceeding. And she could proceed with it, as a person who was simply proceeding, without the weight of all the things she represented. She bought the chestnuts. This is a small detail, but it mattered. She had money in her pocket, not the kind of money she usually carried, which was handled by the household accounts and the butler and the elaborate machinery of upper-class domestic finance, but her own money, coins she had obtained by her own arrangement and carried herself. She exchanged them for paper wrapped around hot chestnuts, and the transaction was simple and immediate in the way that transactions usually were not in her life. She wanted something. She had what was needed to get it. She got it. No intermediary, no domestic staff, no question about whether it was appropriate, just the chestnuts, and the warmth of them in her hands, and the cold of the afternoon around them. There were women who came back from these hours changed in a way that was perceptible to those who knew them well, though not explicable in any way they could have articulated. They were calmer sometimes, more present. There was a quality of having been somewhere real that settled in the body and showed in small ways, in the way they sat, in the particular ease of their attention, in something around the eyes that had briefly stopped performing and not quite resumed. The husbands who noticed this, and some did notice, attributed it to rest, to the particular restoration that apparently came from the mysterious afternoon activity their wives did not explain. And they were not wrong, exactly. It was a kind of rest, but it was rest from them. The returning was always quiet. The hired carriage or the walk back through the familiar blocks the transition from the version of herself that existed outside the frame to the version that existed inside it. This transition, which happened many times over the years of these arrangements, never became entirely easy, because what was being performed in the transition was not just a change of clothing or a change of social register, but something more fundamental. The voluntary re-entry into a life that was hers but was also, in the specific ways this story has been tracing, not entirely her own. She went back. That is the simple version. She went back because she had always planned to go back, because the arrangement was never an escape in the way that some of the other stories of this era were escapes. Not a flight toward a different permanent life, not a rejection of the one she had, but a supplement to it, an amendment, a small addition to the text that changed the meaning slightly without altering the words. She went back, and she went back differently, and the difference was enough, or it was almost enough, or it was what was available, and available is what you use when necessary is out of reach. We have been following the society woman on her escape, but the story belongs equally to the actress, the woman who stepped into the borrowed life, who wore the pearls and attended the calls and performed the self that was not hers. She has been present in the story from the beginning, but she deserves her own attention, her own chapter, because what she did was not simply a service rendered for money. It was an act of considerable skill, and it took place inside a life that was, in its own way, as constrained and as carefully managed as the one she was temporarily inhabiting. The working actress of the 1880s occupied a social position that was genuinely uncertain, not quite respectable, not quite disreputable, dependent on the character of the individual and the quality of her associations, and to a large degree her ability to appear in public without attracting the wrong kind of attention. The legitimate stage offered real careers to real artists, and the women who played at Wallack's and Daly's Theatre and the great touring companies were professionals who took their work seriously and were treated with a corresponding degree of seriousness. But the life was not easy, and the margins were thin. A working actress in New York in 1887 might earn between $15 and $40 a week when employed, a decent income, though employment was seasonal and irregular, and the expenses of the profession were substantial. Costumes were often the actor's own responsibility, at least for the everyday pieces. Makeup was purchased. The boarding house rent was paid weekly, and the boarding houses near the theatres were clean and respectable and cost accordingly. There was no guarantee of work from one season to the next. A company might fold mid-tour, stranding its members in a city that was not their own, requiring the ingenuity and resilience that the profession had always demanded. The women who supplemented their theatrical income with the kind of private arrangement we have been describing were, typically, women who had already developed a particular skill set. They could learn quickly, adapt readily, observe precisely, and perform convincingly under conditions that offered none of the protective structure of the stage. They were also, as a rule, women who understood that the arrangement was confidential, not as an abstract principle, but as a practical necessity. If the arrangement became known, it would end. And it would end badly for both parties, but particularly for the actress, whose reputation was the instrument she used to earn her living. The actress's public reputation rested on a careful balance. She was known as a professional, skilled, reliable, of good character, in the specific sense that mattered to theatre managers and audiences and the press. She was known as a person who could be trusted to perform as contracted, to learn the material, to appear as scheduled. She was not known as a person who gave private performances of a personal nature for wealthy women who wished to be elsewhere. The second reputation would not have cancelled the first exactly, but it would have complicated it in ways that were impossible to predict and therefore not worth risking. Her discretion was, in this sense, as professional as everything else about her. She was not discreet because she had been asked to be. She was discreet because she understood the stakes and the logic and the way that information moves through social systems, and because her professional instincts told her that the correct thing to do with a confidence is to keep it. She had been trained in a profession that required her to enter other people's private emotional states and then leave them cleanly, without contaminating her own life with the residue. This skill extended naturally to the keeping of other people's secrets. What they received in exchange for this discretion was money, yes, but also something less tangible: access. Not to the social world itself. They were visitors, not residents, but to its physical reality. They moved through spaces that were otherwise closed to them. They sat in rooms where the furniture had been made by the finest craftsmen in Europe, and the paintings had been selected by people who bought art the way they bought horses, with expert advice, for enormous sums, with the genuine intention of owning the best. They ate sometimes from china that was worth more than they earned in a year. They wore pearls against their skin and felt the particular weight of them, cool and substantial. There were actresses who found this exposure to wealth uncomfortable, not because they envied the wealth, but because moving through its spaces made visible, in a way that was hard to ignore, exactly how much of the world was organised around the preferences of a very small number of people and exactly what that organisation cost everyone else. The house on Fifth Avenue was beautiful. The people who maintained it were not paid enough to maintain beauty of their own. These facts existed in the same city, which did not reconcile them but simply contained them. The actress Clara Morris, who was one of the great emotional actresses of the period, famous for her ability to produce genuine tears on stage and to convey grief with a visceral authenticity that sometimes unsettled audiences, wrote in her memoirs about visiting wealthy households on private business that she carefully did not specify. She described the sensation of sitting in rooms that were beautiful beyond practical necessity, in houses staffed by dozens of people, and feeling not envy but something closer to grief. The beauty was real, she wrote. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. But it existed inside a world that required such absolute service from so many people that she could not separate the beauty from the conditions of its production. Whether Clara Morris was involved in any of the private arrangements this story concerns is not documented. Her memoirs are selective and strategically vague in certain areas, which is itself a kind of documentation of what could not be said directly. What is clear from her writing is that she moved between worlds in a way that most people in either world did not, and that the movement gave her something that the women on both sides of the arrangement shared: the experience of seeing your own world from the outside, the experience of observing from a position that is neither fully inside nor fully outside, the slightly disorienting clarity of the between. The actress who spent an afternoon as Mrs. Someone or other, pouring tea and discussing the upcoming Newport season, and accepting compliments on a dress that was not hers, returned to her boarding house that evening with a particular kind of tiredness. Not the tiredness of performance. She knew that tiredness well, but the tiredness of a different kind of holding. She had held herself precisely for several hours, had not allowed herself to be simply herself, had inhabited the surface of another life with careful attention. In her room that night, the small, clean room in the boarding house, the washstand, the gas burner, the window with its view of the back of another building, she took off the borrowed dress carefully and set it out for return the following morning. She washed the face she'd composed for the afternoon from her face. She sat at the window in her own clothes, her own self, and looked out at the modest, genuine view. She was tired in the good way, the way you're tired after doing a difficult thing well. The city went on below, indifferent to the afternoon's performance. The gaslights came on at dusk. Someone played a violin in the room above hers, a musician, a student perhaps, working through a passage that kept failing at the same place and being returned to, tried again. Almost right. Not quite. Tried again. The sound of practice. The sound of something being worked on in the dark, patiently, without an audience, for its own sake. She listened to it until it was time to sleep. The violin player upstairs was, she thought, also a kind of performance. Everything was performance. The question was only whether you were performing for an audience that wanted something from you, or whether you were playing the passage for the passage's own sake in a small room above a city that was not particularly listening. Both had their value, both had their cost. She had spent her afternoon doing one kind. The musician upstairs was doing the other. She preferred the other when she had the choice. Tonight she had the choice. Tomorrow she might not. She fell asleep in her own clothes, at her own window, looking at the back of the building across the narrow court, where a single light was still burning in an upper window, someone else awake in the same city, for reasons she did not know and would not ask. The light burned, the violin stopped. The city settled toward midnight, and in the room where the borrowed dress was folded on its chair, waiting to be returned in the morning to the life it actually belonged to, the silence was the silence of something completed, something done and set aside, something that had been held carefully and now could be released. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. sleep well. The pearls were always real. This detail matters more than it might seem. In a world of performances and substitutions, the objects were not performances. The jewellery that a society woman wore to an afternoon call in 1887 was genuine. Genuine stones, genuine gold, genuine craftsmanship from the Paris ateliers of Cartier and Tiffany, and the great workshops that supplied the wealthy of 2 continents. A strand of matched natural pearls, each pearl selected for size and lustre, and the particular pink-white warmth that made a matched strand worth far more than the sum of its parts, was not a costume. It was a statement, a claim. Natural pearls in this period, before the development of cultured pearls in the early 20th century, were genuinely rare and genuinely expensive. A matched strand required years of searching, because matching pearls meant finding specimens of the same size and colour and lustre from the oyster beds of the Persian Gulf or the waters around Ceylon, and the percentage of oysters that produced usable pearls was small, and the percentage of those pearls that matched other pearls was smaller still. The strand that a wealthy woman clasped around her neck in the morning represented the labour of pearl divers in warm, distant waters, and the patience of dealers who had spent years accumulating what was needed, and the significant portion of her husband's fortune that had changed hands to acquire the result. The substitute who wore these pearls was wearing something that the original woman had received, in most cases, as part of the transfer of wealth that constituted a Gilded Age marriage. The trousseau jewellery, the engagement ring, the wedding gift of pearls or diamonds, the pieces purchased by the husband on European honeymoons or presented on important anniversaries, was at once a demonstration of the husband's financial capacity and a form of portable declaration. A woman's jewellery announced her husband's wealth the way his house announced it. She was, in a very literal sense, wearing his money. To loan this jewellery to another woman, to allow it to rest against another woman's skin, to move through the social world in company with another woman's breath and heartbeat and small gestures, was an act that the original woman understood, if she thought about it, as a kind of subversion. The pearls did not know whose neck they were around. The sapphire ring did not care whose finger it encircled. The jewellery that announced her husband's money was, for one afternoon, beyond her husband's knowledge, adorning someone else. The diamonds that said I belong to this life, and this life belongs to me, were, briefly, belonging to nothing in particular, except the performance of belonging. The feeling of the pearls against the actress's skin was the feeling of coolness, then warmth. The pearls always cool when they were first put on, then warming to the temperature of the body they were resting against, which they maintained for the duration of the wearing. This warming was what pearl dealers meant when they spoke of a strand with a good life, the quality of absorbing and reflecting body warmth that made a good strand seem almost alive against the skin. The actress wore them for several hours and felt this warmth, and the quality of the warmth was both pleasant and strange, the warmth of someone else's life borrowed for an afternoon. The society woman's relationship to her own jewellery was complicated. She had been taught from childhood to receive it as evidence of love. The diamond earrings at 16 from her father, the engagement ring from her husband, the birthday sapphires, the anniversary rubies. But she had also learned, gradually over the years of wearing it, that the jewellery was not quite hers. It was part of the estate. It would be documented in the will. If the marriage ended badly, and marriages in the Gilded Age did end badly, did produce divorces and separations and the particular legal wilderness of a Victorian woman trying to establish independent existence, the jewellery was an asset whose ownership would be contested. Consuelo Vanderbilt, who married the Duke of Marlborough in 1895 at her mother's insistence in a ceremony she later described as one of the most wretched experiences of her life, wrote extensively in her memoirs about the material world of her marriage. The jewellery was extraordinary, pieces accumulated over generations of Marlborough wealth, now supplemented by the flood of Vanderbilt money that had restored the family's estates and reopened their houses. She wore it correctly. She wore it at the correct occasions. She wore it, she wrote, the way she wore everything in that period, as part of a costume that was required, not chosen. What she valued, she discovered, and this discovery came slowly over years, and was confirmed only much later when she had the freedom to pursue it, was not the stones themselves, but the small, unglamorous objects she had acquired independently. A notebook in which she wrote things she could not say. a small painting she had purchased herself from a painter who was not famous and would not become famous, but whose work gave her something. The things she had chosen, not inherited. The objects that said I rather than we or us or the family name. The language of objects in Gilded Age women's lives was dense and specific and worth reading carefully. What a woman kept in her dressing table drawer, not the public display of the jewel case but the private arrangement of the smaller, less formal objects, was a kind of self-portrait. A small photograph, perhaps, of a woman she admired, a pressed flower from some occasion whose emotional significance she had not shared, a letter she kept and should not have kept, a small notebook, a key to something. The key is a particularly rich object in this context. Gilded Age houses were full of locked things, desk drawers, jewel cases, medicine cabinets, the storerooms in the basement where the extra silver was kept. Each of these locks had a key, and the keys were generally kept by the person in charge of the relevant domain. The butler kept the wine cellar key, the housekeeper kept the linen room key, the lady of the house kept the jewel case key. To keep a key was to assert authority over its domain. The woman who kept a key to a room or a drawer that no one else could open had, in that key, a small piece of genuine autonomy. The women who arranged substitutions often spoke, in the few accounts we have, about the importance of a letter that could be locked away. The correspondence with the actress, such as it was, required a locked drawer, a fire, or an intermediary who kept nothing in writing. The careful management of paper was an essential part of the arrangement's maintenance, because paper was evidence, and evidence was danger. A woman who burned her letters regularly, or which many women of the period did, was managing information in the same way she managed her household, with attention to what should be retained and what should be released. The maid who noticed the small peculiarities, the pearls returned slightly warmer than they had left, the gloves with a different kind of wear at the fingertips, the calling card case emptied in a slightly different order than usual, was a character in this story whose silence was itself a kind of contribution. She noticed. She said nothing. Perhaps she understood. Perhaps she had her own small arrangements with the day, her own careful compartments of experience that did not quite match what the household's ledger of her time recorded. The pearls, returned to their case at the end of the afternoon, caught the light from the gas lamp in the same way they always had. The case clicked shut. The maid put it away. The house went on around its objects the way houses always do, holding the things placed inside them, not asking questions, providing the steady background of material continuity that allows people to believe their lives are more stable than they are. And across the city, in the boarding house room or the small studio or wherever that afternoon had been spent, a woman who had been briefly nothing in particular settled into her own skin again, and found it, as she always did, a complicated fit. The fit is always complicated. We're always slightly larger than the lives we're given to live in, or slightly different in shape, finding the places where we press against the edges. The Gilded Age women who arranged these substitutions had simply found one particular way to press back. The pearls were real, the arrangement was real, the hours outside the frame were real. These things existed alongside each other, in the same city, in the same life, held by the same woman who was always beneath everything, more various than the performance she gave. There was an entire vocabulary of objects in the Gilded Age drawing room that a careful observer could read like text. The placement of flowers told you which guests were expected and how they were to be regarded. The choice of which photographs were displayed on the mantelpiece, and in what configuration communicated something about the family's self-presentation. The books on the side table, not the serious books, which were kept in the library but the books left out as part of the room's surface, told you something about what intellectual positioning the household wished to project, or at least what the household's decorator had advised. A woman who had arranged for someone else to inhabit her drawing room for an afternoon had necessarily thought carefully about all of this. The substitute needed to be able to move through the room's vocabulary with some fluency, to know that the photograph on the left was the husband's mother and should be referred to with specific warmth, that the book on the table was one she had actually read and could discuss briefly, that the small bronze figure near the window was a gift from a family friend and had a story attached to it that sometimes came up. This briefing, comprehensive as it was, also produced in the real woman an experience she had not expected, the experience of describing her own drawing room to someone who was hearing it for the first time. When you live in a place for years, you stop seeing it. The accumulated objects of a life become furniture in the literal sense, present, functional, unremarkable. But to describe the room to someone who did not know it was to see it again, to account for every detail, to explain the why of each placement in a way that daily life never required. The real woman, running through the briefing, discovered things she had not thought about in years, that she did not particularly like the portrait above the mantelpiece but had kept it, because removing it would require an explanation, that the arrangement of the flowers had been dictated by her mother-in-law on a visit 3 years ago, and she had simply maintained it ever since, that she had stopped noticing the smell of the house entirely and only remembered it when she smelled something similar elsewhere, beeswax and coal and the particular expensive scent of fresh-cut lilies that her husband's housekeeper ordered on Mondays. The objects of her life were not hers in the way that the objects of someone who had chosen them were hers. The trousseau silver, the inherited furniture, the wedding gift china, the paintings selected by her husband's family's taste. These were the material vocabulary of a life she had entered, not a life she had built. She owned them in the legal sense, she used them daily. But their ownership had the quality of custodianship rather than possession. She was their current keeper, responsible for their maintenance and correct use. The house was also, in this sense, not quite hers but held in trust, managed on behalf of the family name and the family position that the house was meant to represent. The actress, fastening the pearls at the mirror, was fastening someone else's claim to someone else's life, and yet, in the fastening, in the weight of the strand against the collarbone, in the small practiced gesture of the clasp, she inhabited the claim completely. This was what good performance required, not the approximation of conviction, but conviction itself, temporary and assumed but genuine while it lasted. She was not pretending to be this woman. For the duration of the afternoon, in the specific and contained way that the theatre had trained her to understand, she was. The evening after a substitution, when the pearls were back in their case and the house had settled into its ordinary rhythms, the real woman sometimes sat at her dressing table and looked at the jewellery she had not worn that day, the ring, the earrings, the bracelet, resting in their silk-lined compartments, waiting, as they always waited, for the next occasion that required them. She picked up the pearls and held them for a moment. They were cool again. They had been against someone else's skin, and now they had forgotten it, as objects forget things, cooling to the temperature of the drawer and the night air in the absence of any body to warm them. She set them down, she closed the case. The objects would never tell. This was one of the things about objects that the era had made useful. They held nothing. A pearl did not remember who had worn it. A drawing room did not register that its surfaces had been read by a stranger. The household silver did not retain the impression of different hands. The continuity of things provided a kind of ongoing permission. The world looked the same as it had always looked, and therefore, as far as the world was concerned, it was the same as it had always been. She had learned from years of living with this, that the world's indifference to her interior life was both its cruelty and its gift. Summer came to the Gilded Age like a second season of theatre, with its own cast and its own staging requirements, and its own particular quality of audience. The wealthy left New York in late June and migrated to Newport, Rhode Island, which was by the 1880s so thoroughly colonized by the richest families in America that it had ceased to be, in any meaningful sense, a place, and had become instead a stage set maintained at enormous expense for the performance of a social summer. The houses along Bellevue Avenue were called cottages, which was among the most persistent and deliberate understatements in American history. The Vanderbilt cottage, the Breakers, had 70 rooms. The marble floors came from Algerian quarries. The ceiling frescoes were painted by European masters. The kitchen employed its own full-time staff of 12 people, and ran on a schedule that produced 7-course dinners every evening of the season. The journey from New York to Newport was itself a social event. The Fall River Line, the overnight steamboat that carried passengers from New York Harbor up through Long Island Sound to Fall River, where a train completed the journey to Newport, was a scene of its own. The boats were elegant and well-appointed, with staterooms and a grand saloon, and a dining room that served the meals of a quality that reflected the wealth of the clientele. People encountered each other on the boat who would encounter each other all summer. The social season had, on the Fall River Line, its first performance. Newport in summer was in some ways more controlled than New York in winter. The community was smaller. Everyone knew everyone. the social obligations were concentrated into a shorter period with a corresponding intensification. Morning involved a promenade on Bellevue Avenue, during which you walked your correct distance and greeted your correct acquaintances at the correct temperature of warmth, and the entire operation was observed by the entire population of the summer colony, as well as by any number of journalists who had made the summer migration themselves specifically to document these promenades. Afternoon brought the drives, the long circuit of Ocean Drive in a carriage, at exactly the right pace, with exactly the right companions, in exactly the right equipage. The equipage mattered. A carriage that was slightly less new than the season required, horses that were perfectly matched but perhaps a shade less perfectly than the previous summer. These details were noted. The society columns in the New York papers ran regular dispatches from Newport correspondents who understood their readers' appetite for exactly this kind of information: who was driving with whom, what horses were being used, whether the new carriage from the coach builder in Paris had arrived yet. The surveillance was, in some respects, more intense here than in the city. In New York there were millions of people and dozens of neighborhoods, and a woman with determination and resources could move between them. In Newport there were perhaps 2,000 people in the summer colony, most of them in a small geographic area, and the social world had eyes everywhere, in the houses of the neighbors, in the journalistic dispatches that the society reporters sent to the New York papers 3 times a week, in the network of servants who moved between households and carried information the way migratory birds carry seeds. The servants' network was, in many ways, more comprehensive than the social network it served. Servants who worked in different households encountered each other at the markets, at church, at the social gatherings that servants organised for themselves in the hours when their employers were occupied or sleeping. A lady's maid who had spent 3 years in the Newport cottage knew not only what happened in her own household, but had a reasonably accurate picture of what was happening in several of the neighbouring ones. She knew which households had problems and what kinds of problems they were. She knew which arrangements were being made and what kinds of arrangements they were. She knew, often, more than anyone in the social columns knew. And yet Newport was also, for the women who needed it, a more complex geography than it appeared. The estates had large grounds, acres of formal garden and lawn that extended toward the ocean, with paths and hedged enclosures and summer houses placed at considered distances from the main house. A woman could be on her own property and still be effectively alone, if she chose the right moment and the right path. The ocean itself was there, present beyond every eastern window, constant, indifferent, smelling of salt and distance and the accumulated miles between here and wherever you were not. The ocean is one of the things that does not change between the 1880s and now. The same Atlantic that rolled past the cliff walk in Newport when these women walked there still rolls past it. The sound of it, the particular low percussion of waves against stone, heard in the night when the house has gone quiet and the wind is from the right direction, is the same sound. It is worth resting in this for a moment. The sound of the ocean is a sound that has been heard by every generation that has ever lived near it, and it connects them all in a small but genuine way. The extended arrangements, the substitutions that lasted not for an afternoon but for several days, or even the better part of a week, were more complex to organise and more expensive to maintain, but they were not impossible in the Newport context. A woman could establish the fiction of a headache. In the Gilded Age, a woman's head was expected to ache. The rest cure, that most paradoxical of medical prescriptions, in which a woman suffering from nervous exhaustion was told to rest entirely, to do nothing, to see no one, to lie in a darkened room for weeks, was an accepted social institution, and its first requirement, the withdrawal from social engagements, was something a household could accommodate without arousing particular suspicion. Dr. S. Weir Mitchell, who had formulated the rest cure and who was the most prominent neurologist in America in the 1880s, treated a significant number of wealthy women for what he called neurasthenia, nervous exhaustion, a condition he attributed to the excessive use of the nervous system by women who attempted too much intellectual or social activity. His prescription of complete rest was widely followed. The bitter irony that a woman who was exhausted by the constant performance of social life was prescribed more withdrawal from the world, more isolation, more dependence, more enforced passivity, was not lost on all of his patients. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who had undergone his rest cure in the late 1880s, wrote about it in the story that would become the most devastating fictional critique of the treatment and of the conditions that produced it. The actress who substituted for several days operated under conditions that required more complete preparation. She needed to know not just the social calendar, but the household. She needed to understand the relationships between the servants, who deferred to whom, who could be trusted with which information, who was likely to report an anomaly to the mistress's husband or mother. She needed to know the rhythms of the morning, when the maid came, what was expected for breakfast, whether the children were brought to say good morning before their lessons. The children were a particular complication. A mother's children know their mother in ways that no amount of preparation can fully account for. They know the specific quality of her voice when she calls them, the particular smell of her when she embraces them, the way she holds them, and the words she uses for them in private. An actress who was substituting for their mother at the afternoon carriage drive would never encounter them in these intimate contexts. The arrangement was specifically designed to avoid them, but the existence of the children was always present as a limit, a boundary beyond which the substitution could not safely extend. The ocean was the constant background to the Newport episode of this story, the sound of it at night, the smell of it in the morning, the way it organized the light on the horizon into something that was always changing and never quite predictable. The women who stood at their bedroom windows in the early morning and looked out at the ocean were looking at the one thing in their immediate environment that was entirely outside their social world. The ocean did not care about calling cards. It did not keep a list. It simply went on being what it was, enormous and continuous, making the sound it always made against the rocks below the bluffs. Some of them walked there in the early morning, before the household was properly awake, in the time between the servant's day beginning and the family's day beginning. They walked on the cliff walk, the long rocky path that ran along the ocean edge of the great estates, open to the sea on one side and to the back gardens on the other. In this thin strip of time and space before the day's performance began, they were neither here nor there. They were simply walking in the salt wind above the ocean. The cliff walk was technically accessible to anyone, which made it slightly unusual in the Newport context. It was one of the few spaces in the summer colony where the social distinctions were not enforced by architecture or custom. Servants walked there, locals walked there, visitors who did not own cottages walked there. The women from the great houses who walked there in the early morning sometimes encountered people they would never have encountered anywhere else, and these encounters had a different quality from the managed introductions of the social world. Brief, neutral, unremarkable, the way encounters are when there is no social machinery around them requiring them to mean something. They returned to their houses and their lives and their substitutes and their arrangements. The day resumed its shape, but the morning walk was theirs, uncountable, unrecorded, belonging to no social ledger, pressed like a flower between the pages of a life that was otherwise entirely public. Rest in this for a while. The ocean is still there. The cliff walk is still there. The same light falls on it in the early morning. The same salt wind comes off the water. The same sound of waves against stone fills the air. The women who walked there are gone, but the walk remains. And somewhere in the quality of any ocean sound, the sound that is in the air right now, held in the imagination the way certain sounds always are. The morning walks continue, unhurried, unobserved, belonging only to the person who is taking them. No performance, however carefully rehearsed, is without its uncertainties. The theatre understands this. Every night there is the possibility that the gas jet will sputter at the wrong moment, that the leading man will forget a line, that the audience will fail to be where you need them emotionally when you need them there. The mark of a professional is not that nothing goes wrong. It is that when something goes wrong, the professional adjusts without letting the audience see the adjustment. They carry on. The seam remains invisible. The substitution arrangements, managed as carefully as they were, had their own version of these uncertainties. There were moments when the fiction strained, moments when someone said something that required knowledge the substitute did not have, or recognized something in the face across from them that was slightly different from what they expected, or asked a question that the careful briefing had not anticipated. In these moments, the quality that saved the arrangement was invariably the same quality: composure, the measured pause, the gentle redirection, the ability to receive unexpected information without visibly receiving it. There was an afternoon, in one of the better documented cases, when a woman, the wife of a prominent railroad attorney, whose name does not appear in this account because her descendants are still living, arrived at a charity tea and found herself seated directly across from her own sister-in-law, who had travelled unexpectedly from Philadelphia and whose presence had not been part of any briefing. The sister-in-law was warm and expansive, and immediately began a conversation about family matters specific enough that a stranger's knowledge would have been exposed within minutes. The substitute did what the best performers always do in an unforeseen situation. She led with what she had. She was warm, she was interested. She listened with genuine attention, one of the most powerful tools available, because people in the act of being listened to become less focused on what the listener is saying, and more focused on what they themselves are saying. When specific information was required, she used a technique that actors call bridging. She acknowledged the subject in a way that invited more information from the other person, rather than revealing that she did not have the information herself. She said something like, "I was just thinking about that very thing. Tell me what you've heard." The sister-in-law told her at length. The arrangement survived. The debrief after this particular afternoon was more detailed than usual. The real woman needed to know exactly what had been discussed, because the sister-in-law would certainly follow up, and the follow-up conversation needed to feel like a continuation of the earlier one rather than a beginning. The actress had remembered with considerable accuracy the details of the Philadelphia house and its renovations, the anxieties about the eldest nephew's prospects, the complicated feelings about a mutual relation who had recently done something that the family was managing carefully. The real woman listened, made notes that she would burn later, and adjusted her mental model of her family situation accordingly. Another near miss involved a chance encounter in the carriage drive on Bellevue Avenue during the Newport season. The substitute was in the carriage, at the correct hour, in the correct dress, making the correct circuit, when the carriage of a woman known to be the real woman's most intimate friend drew level. The friend called out, her carriage slowed, the two vehicles came abreast, and began a conversation that had clearly been waiting to happen, a conversation full of the particular shorthand of long friendship, the references and the assumed shared knowledge and the warmth that does not need to explain itself because it has been earned over years. This was the most dangerous kind of encounter, not a formal acquaintance who needed only surface performance, but someone who knew the original woman in her fullness. The substitute could feel, even through the careful management of the moment, that she was in a different kind of territory. The friend was not suspicious. There was no reason for suspicion, but she was expecting a quality of presence that was specific to one particular person, and the substitute was not that person. She was close, she was skilled, but she was not her. The conversation was kept short. The substitute said she was not herself today, a phrase that carried for her a particular ironic weight, and that she would write. The carriages separated. The friend moved on, perhaps slightly puzzled, perhaps noting a faint quality of reserve that was unlike her friend's usual manner, perhaps filing it away as one of the small, unexplained variations in human behaviour that daily life is full of. People are not consistently themselves. This is something that the women on both sides of these arrangements understood very well. The great actresses of the period had learned something that the social world did not teach, that the most convincing performance is the one that incorporates the reality of the moment rather than fighting it. Sarah Bernhardt, who was perhaps the greatest actor of her generation and who was celebrated for roles that required the most extreme emotional register, dying women, mad women, women consumed by passion, said that she never played the emotion directly. She played the attempt to control the emotion. The result was a performance of such internal conflict and such genuine effort that audiences experienced it as the emotion itself, rather than as its representation. The substitute who said she was not herself today was, in the smallest way, performing this principle. She did not claim that everything was fine. She claimed that something was slightly off, a claim that was true, in a sense, though not in the sense the friend understood. The acknowledgement of imperfection, offered with composure, was more convincing than a perfect performance would have been, because perfection is always slightly suspicious. People are not perfect. The substitute knew this and used it. The near misses left a particular residue. For the real woman, hearing about them afterward, there was a moment of cold understanding. How close this had come. How much depended on the skill and composure of someone whose name she could tell no one. The vulnerability of the arrangement was, in these moments, very clear. She was entrusted to a stranger who was becoming less strange, yes, but who was also, in every formal sense of the word, someone who knew her secret. And yet the arrangements continued. The risk was real, but it was also, compared to the alternative, manageable. The alternative, the unbroken continuance of the life she was escaping, with no hours of her own, no space outside the performance, no experience of herself as something other than a function in someone else's world, felt, in the private calculation she made repeatedly, riskier. Not to her reputation, which would have survived, not to her household, which would have continued, but to something inside her that she had fewer and fewer words for the longer she spent without it, the sense of being a person rather than a position. There is a kind of courage that is not dramatic. It does not announce itself, it does not require an audience. It is simply the continued willingness to maintain a thing that matters to you even when the maintenance is complicated, even when the risk is real, even when the easier path would be to give it up and settle back into the life that requires nothing from you except your presence. The woman who organised these arrangements went to her suffrage meeting or her studio or her rented room or wherever the afternoon took her on an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary carriage wearing ordinary clothes. She returned at the agreed time. The house was as she had left it. The substitute had managed the near miss, and the near miss was already over, settled into the past, becoming just a story that might someday be told, or might not. The social machinery continued to turn. The calls were made, the cards were left, the correct things were said at the correct times to the correct people. Somewhere in all of this, a woman who was supposed to be somewhere she was not had been, and the world had continued without noticing, and this was, in its quiet way, extraordinary. The unremarkable continuation of the world is one of the most reliable comforts available. Things go on. The machinery turns. The calling cards accumulate in the silver dish and are sorted and filed and answered. Tomorrow's obligations are the same as today's obligations in their reliable, pressing way. And in the midst of all this continuation, a small thing that mattered happened, and it does not need the world to have noticed it to have been real. She slept, and in her sleep, somewhere past the point where the day's events had finished processing themselves, she floated in the place where none of it mattered. Not the near miss, not the substitute, not the pearls or the calling cards or the careful management of appearances, just sleep, just rest. The way rest always comes in the end to even the most complicated life. The arrangements rarely stayed purely transactional. This was not something either party necessarily intended or planned for. A transaction requires two separate people, maintaining separate positions across a clear boundary, and the arrangements began that way. One woman with something to provide, one woman with something to purchase, a meeting in a neutral room, a careful exchange of information, a sum of money. But the nature of what was being exchanged was personal, in ways that a more straightforward transaction is not, and over time, through the careful meetings and the debriefings, and the particular intimacy of two people who share a significant secret, something else sometimes grew. The actress taught the society woman certain things about performance, not in any formal or consciously pedagogical way, not as a lesson, but in the way that one person's expertise inevitably educates the person observing it. She taught by example what it looks like to inhabit a role completely, to not apologize for the role, to not strain against it, to not make small gestures of protest against the performance you are giving. She taught the difference between performing anxiety and performing composure, that the second is not the suppression of the first, but the replacement of it, the genuine occupation of a calmer state that requires the same kind of presence as any other emotional truth. This was, for many of these women, a revelation. They had spent their lives performing the composure that was expected of them, the unruffled surface, the cool response, the face that did not show too much, but they had been performing it as suppression, holding the anxiety below the composed surface, maintaining the surface by force. The actress showed them, simply by doing it herself, that there was another way. You did not have to suppress the thing beneath the surface. You could genuinely occupy the surface. The composure could be the real state, not the mask over the real state. The society woman, observing the actress in her social element, understood something she had perhaps known intellectually, but not experienced viscerally. that the performance she herself gave every day was a performance. This sounds obvious, but there is a difference between knowing you are performing and understanding it from the outside, seeing your own life described accurately and matter-of-factly by someone who has observed it closely but is not inside it. The actress's briefings, delivered in the flat, professional language of someone cataloguing the requirements of a role, had the strange effect of making the society woman see her own life as a series of choices, even the parts that had never felt like choices. The actress told her, "You sit at the same angle in every chair. Not because chairs require it, but because you have been taught to appear attentive at precisely this angle. When you disagree, you smile first. When you are bored, you ask a question about the other person. When you're tired, you become more formal, as if formality is the body armor you put on when the resources are running low. These things are not wrong. They are simply learned. They are what you do." Another person might have learned different things. Hearing this, the society woman felt something complicated. It was partly recognition, yes, these are exactly the things I do, and partly discomfort, because what the actress was describing was herself rendered as a series of managed performances with no obvious self underneath them, and partly under the discomfort something that might have been relief, because if these things were learned, they might also be unlearned, or set aside, or simply understood differently. The corset was not her spine. The calling cards were not her name. The performance was not ultimately the performer. This distinction between the performance and the performer was one of the organizing principles of the theatrical profession. An actor is not the character she plays. The character exists in the performance and ends at the curtain. The actor continues, goes to dinner, has opinions, falls asleep, wakes up in the morning in her own life. The ability to maintain this distinction, to fully inhabit a character while performing, and to fully release it after, was what separated professional actors from the people who, as the saying in the profession went, took the character home with them. Taking the character home was amateur. Leaving it in the theatre was professional. The society woman who understood her own life as a performance was doing something that had not been available to her before. She was beginning to distinguish between the performance and the performer, and the performer, she was starting to understand, was the part of her that sat alone in the rented room or walked on the cliff walk in the early morning. The performer was the part that had arranged all of this. The performer was perhaps more her than the performance had ever been. What the society woman taught the actress was harder to articulate because it was less immediately obvious. It was something about the cost of maintenance. The actress had understood, intellectually, that the world of the 400 required constant performance. What she had not fully understood, until she began moving through its rooms with some frequency, was the sheer volume of it. Not just the social performance, but the interior work that accompanied it. The monitoring of one's own thoughts for anything that might, if accidentally expressed, create a problem. The continuous management of appearance across multiple registers simultaneously. She had thought, when she began these arrangements, that the wealth was the insulation, that to have all this money and all these beautiful things was to be essentially comfortable. What she discovered was that the money paid for the set, and the set was beautiful, and the beauty was real. But the performance required to live in the set was relentless in ways that the set itself could not compensate for. The pearls were real. The exhaustion was also real. Over the months, or in some cases years, that these arrangements continued, a kind of understanding developed between the two women that had elements of friendship but was not quite friendship, because friendship requires a mutuality that arrangements with significant power differentials cannot entirely provide. The society woman controlled the arrangement. She could end it at any time, for any reason. The actress could not. This asymmetry was present in every room they shared, present but not always acknowledged. And yet there was genuine regard. There was genuine curiosity. Each woman was genuinely interested in the life she was not living, and genuine interest is not faked even when other things are. There was the particular warmth of shared complicity, which is its own kind of intimacy. To trust someone with a secret is to give them something real of yourself, and the giving makes them, in a small but unmistakable way, yours. The two women, when they met for the quiet debriefing that followed each afternoon, were meeting in a space that was genuinely unusual in that era, a space in which two women of different class backgrounds were treating each other, at least temporarily, as equals. Not social equals, the asymmetry was always there, but something more fundamental. They were treating each other as people with inner lives of equal weight, as people whose experiences and observations and feelings had equal validity. This too was something that the Gilded Age social structure did not generally produce, and it had its own value. The actress, who had spent her professional life inhabiting other people's emotions and then leaving them behind at the end of the performance, found that these particular emotions did not leave behind so cleanly. The women she substituted for, their lives, their desires, their careful management of the gap between what they were permitted to want and what they actually wanted, stayed with her in a way that stage roles did not. Perhaps because there was no curtain, no audience applauding the end, just a carriage going away and a house closing around its ordinary evening, and everything she had learned about the life inside it, held now in her professional memory alongside everything else she had learned about how people managed to live in conditions that were not designed for their happiness. She carried this with her. She carried all of it, the weight of the pearls, the angle of the chair, the particular quality of a life that was beautiful and constrained in exactly equal measure. She carried it the way a good actor carries a role after the run has ended. Not obsessively, not clinically, but with the attentiveness of someone who has been genuinely changed by inhabiting a perspective that was not their own. What she did with what she'd learned was the question that only she could answer. The theatre gave her opportunities to use it. Roles that required the interior knowledge of lives like these, played for audiences who wanted to believe the performance was real, and perhaps the performances were, in small ways, changed by what she knew. Perhaps there was something in them that audiences felt as truth, without knowing where the truth came from, without being able to name what made this particular actress's drawing room performance feel different from others, more specific, more inhabited, more genuinely present in a world that the actress had, after all, visited. The arrangement produced over time a kind of knowledge that neither woman could have acquired by any other means, the knowledge of what it was like to live inside the other's life, partial and imperfect as that knowledge was. The actress knew what the drawing room smelled like in the afternoon, and what the pearls weighed and what the calls required. The society woman knew what it was to perform without the protective scaffolding of real identity, to carry a role into a situation that had not been scripted, to improvise in the manner of someone who trusts her craft more than her certainty. Both kinds of knowledge changed the person who held them. Neither transformation was visible from the outside. Both were real. There were evenings when the society woman sat in the middle of the correct dinner at the correct table and thought about what the actress had said, about the angle of the chair, about the smile that preceded the disagreement, about the formality that came on like armour when the resources were running low. She thought about these things with a clarity that was new, the clarity of the observed, and she understood herself in a slightly larger way than she had before. Not a revelatory understanding, not the sudden collapse of illusion, just a small incremental expansion of the distance between herself and the performance, a slightly wider view of the thing she was doing and the person doing it. The space that opened between a woman and her performance, once it opened, did not close again. This was perhaps the most lasting consequence of the arrangements, not the specific hours spent elsewhere, not the specific meetings attended or paintings seen or rooms inhabited, but the permanent slight widening of the gap between who she was and what she showed. The gap had always existed, but she had not always known it was there. Knowing it was there was a different kind of existence, more complicated perhaps, but also more honest, and honesty in a world that required so much performance was a thing with its own quiet, sustaining power. The education was never discussed directly. Neither woman said, "I am teaching you something." Neither said, "I have learned from you." The exchange happened in the space between the words, in the small observations that accumulated over many afternoons, in the particular quality of the attention that each brought to the other, the quality of genuine curiosity, which is one of the rarer things, and which the social world with its managed interactions and scripted encounters rarely produced. Two women who were supposed to be nothing to each other except the parties to a private arrangement had, without quite meaning to, become something more, witnesses to each other's lives. A witness is different from an observer. An observer watches from outside. A witness is admitted to something, given access to the particular truth of a person or a moment, and the admission creates a responsibility, however unspoken. These women were witnesses to each other in a way that their husbands, their families, and their social circles were not and could not be, because the witnessing required the particular vantage point of the partially outside, the not quite there, close enough to see clearly, different enough to see at all. The arrangements ended eventually. They ended for various reasons. The actress left the city for another company, or the society woman's circumstances changed, or the risk began to feel heavier than the reward, or simply the season ended and the household moved to Newport and the city logistics that had made everything possible were no longer in place. They ended, and the specific practice ceased. But what had been learned in the practice did not end with it. It settled into the person who had learned it, becoming part of her way of moving through the world, one of the many small and permanent changes that a life accumulates in its passage through its own particular set of circumstances. She carried it the way she carried everything that mattered, quietly, without making too much of it, in the part of herself that the performance did not reach, the part that had always been there, watching from behind the composed surface, attentive and intact, waiting for the moments when the performance was not required, and the real life could simply be itself, without costume, without audience, without the beautiful, exhausting weight of all the things she was supposed to be. Most of the arrangements ended quietly, without drama, the way most complicated things end. Not with a moment of rupture, but with a gradual fading, a slowing of the machinery until the machinery stopped. The seasons changed. The social calendar shifted. The circumstances that had made the arrangement necessary, or at least had made it feel necessary, themselves changed, as circumstances always do, and the women on both sides moved into the next version of their lives, carrying what they carried. Some arrangements ended because the real woman's situation changed. A death in the family that reset the social calendar entirely, that changed what was expected of her, and created new obligations that made the old ones smaller by comparison. A husband's illness that brought her into a different proximity to the household's daily life. A child's crisis. The daughter who needed help. The son who had done something requiring management. That required her presence not as a performer, but as a mother. And this need had a clarity that cut through the complicated machinery of the other arrangements. Genuine need is its own kind of clarity. The woman who had spent 2 seasons arranging substitutions so that she could attend suffrage meetings on Thursday afternoons was, when her child was sick, not attending suffrage meetings. She was in the nursery, or in the parlour where the doctor consulted, or in the room where the child was asking for her by name. Not her name in the social ledger, her name in the child's mouth. These were different things, and the difference was important, and she knew it. Some ended because the actress's situation changed, a better role, a long tour, a company that was leaving for Chicago and would not return until spring. The theatre did not hold still for private arrangements. It moved constantly, reformed constantly, offered and withdrew its opportunities on a schedule that had nothing to do with the social calendar of the wealthy. The actress who had been available for 3 seasons might be, in the 4th season, entirely unavailable, touring through the Midwest, or ill or settled into a long-running production that occupied her evenings and her days equally. This was one of the structural limitations of the arrangement. It depended on the availability of a skilled woman whose professional life was inherently unpredictable. The best substitute was also the most likely to have a career that took her away. A less skilled substitute was safer in the sense of being more available, but less safe in every other sense. The women who arranged these substitutions understood this, and understood that the arrangement was inherently temporary, not because either party intended to end it, but because the lives around it were themselves in motion. Some ended more rarely because someone found out. Not the husband. In almost none of the documented or partially documented cases did the husband discover the arrangement, or if he did, chose not to discover it in the full sense, allowing himself to not know a thing he had perhaps guessed at but preferred not to examine too closely. Men in the Gilded Age had their own arrangements. Their clubs were a kind of substitute life, a place where the performance of the public self was somewhat relaxed. They were not, on the whole, eager to examine the inner lives of their wives too closely. It was more often a servant who found out, a new lady's maid who was too observant and not yet fully absorbed into the household's unspoken rules about what was and was not noticed. a footman who happened to be at the back door at the wrong time, a housemaid who recognised the actress from a theatrical bill she had seen posted on a wall downtown, and who said nothing directly but whose recognition changed the quality of her silences. These discoveries rarely produced immediate consequences. They settled into the household's knowledge base the way other knowledge settled there. Noted, filed, not acted upon, present, but dormant. The management of a servant who knew was its own skill, and one that the women of the Gilded Age were not without. The gift of a new hat. The small raise in the quarterly wage. The tone of voice that communicated without saying it, that discretion was not only expected but valued, that the value was real, that the arrangement between mistress and maid was in this as in other things a reciprocal one. Most servants had their own things they did not wish examined closely. The management of mutual knowledge was a household skill as much as the management of the silver. The real woman, when she became aware that a servant knew, had to make a calculation. The servant's knowledge was not inherently dangerous. Servants knew many things. What was required was a kind of acknowledgement without acknowledgement, a slightly improved situation, or simply the atmosphere of trust that made a servant feel that their loyalty was recognised and valued. Most of the time, this was sufficient. The endings that were chosen rather than imposed were perhaps the most interesting. The real woman who decided at some point that the arrangement had served its purpose, that the hours it had given her had changed something in her, had settled into her in a way that made the arrangement itself no longer as necessary. Not because she had stopped wanting freedom, but because the wanting had been answered enough times that it was no longer quite as urgent, quite as consuming. There is a particular quality to satisfaction that is different from the quality of desire. Desire is bright and restless. Satisfaction is quieter. It doesn't promise more. It simply confirms that something real happened, that the thing you wanted was genuinely what you wanted, and that the wanting, when met, left something behind. The woman who had spent her Tuesday afternoons at the suffrage meeting did not necessarily need to continue spending them there to carry what she had learned there. It had become part of her interior landscape. It was there when she needed it. Alva Vanderbilt's divorce from William K. Vanderbilt in 1895 was a scandal that she engineered deliberately, knowing the cost and accepting it, because she had reached the point at which the cost of continuing was higher than the cost of ending. She was not most women. She had more resources, more nerve, more appetite for the kind of conflict that divorce in that era required. But the shape of her decision was recognisable to many women who had much smaller options, the moment at which the performance becomes impossible to continue. The women who arranged substitutions were, by their nature, women who had not reached that point, or who had found the substitution as a way of making the reaching of that point less immediate. They had found a pressure valve, a way to continue the performance indefinitely by building in, at intervals, the specific breaks from it that made the performance survivable. Whether this was wisdom or avoidance, whether it served them better or worse than the more dramatic alternative, is impossible to say. It probably varied. What can be said is that the endings, when they came, were usually gentle. A letter thanking the actress for her assistance over the past season and wishing her well in the coming one. A final payment that was slightly more generous than the arithmetic required. A small gift, a book perhaps, or a piece of jewellery that was the woman's own to give rather than her husband's to document. Something chosen rather than inherited. The actress received these endings with the professionalism she brought to everything, and filed the arrangement in the same category as all the other roles she had played, as something she had done well that had mattered while it was happening, that she now moved on from without looking back. She had learned things, she had earned her money, she had kept the confidence. The arrangement was over. The house on Fifth Avenue or the cottage in Newport went on being what it was. The seasons continued. The calling cards accumulated in the silver dish. The social machinery turned. And in the rooms above, behind the locked door of a late-night writing desk, the woman who had arranged and managed and eventually ended the arrangement lived on inside the life she had always lived. Slightly different than she had been before, changed in ways that would not be visible in any social column, in any letter, in any diary that would later be opened by a descendant looking for evidence of who she had been. The change was real. It did not need to be visible. It lived in the particular quality of her presence in the rooms she moved through every day, in the way she listened at dinner parties, in the small adjustments she had made to the interior arrangement of her own life that no one else could see or measure. She had been somewhere. She had come back. She was not quite the same woman who had left. The change accumulated quietly over time, the way all significant changes do, not as a single shift, but as the aggregate of small ones, none decisive on its own. A small decision made differently. A social obligation declined for the first time without elaborate justification. A letter written and sent that would not have been written a year earlier. These things were not dramatic. They were not the actions of someone who had decided to transform herself. They were simply the actions of someone who had, through the particular education of these arrangements, developed a slightly clearer idea of what she actually thought, as distinct from what she had been trained to think. There were women who used what they had gained in the arrangements to push further, toward the suffrage work that was beginning to feel, by the 1890s, like something that might actually succeed, or toward the artistic ambitions that the social world had never provided a vessel for, or toward the quieter but equally significant project of raising daughters differently than they themselves had been raised. Daughters who were allowed to ask questions, daughters whose reading was not monitored as closely, daughters who were told, sometimes directly and sometimes by example, that the performance was not the whole story. Other women used what they had gained for nothing more than the quiet sustaining of themselves, for the interior resource of knowing that they were more than the role, that the role was something they inhabited rather than something that had swallowed them. This knowing, maintained privately without expression or action or any visible consequence, was still a form of living that was different from the living that had preceded it. The woman who knows she's performing is performing differently from the woman who believes the performance is reality. The difference is internal and invisible and absolutely real. The arrangements ended. They all ended eventually, because circumstances changed, or because the risk felt heavier than the reward, or simply because the season ended and the household moved and the specific logistics that had made everything possible no longer held. They ended the way most things that matter end, not with ceremony, not with a clear closing, but with a gradual cessation, a tapering off, until one day you realize that the thing has stopped and you're not quite sure when the stopping happened. She did not mourn the ending exactly. The ending was right. What it had given her had been given, and the giving was not undone by the stopping. She carried what she had learned the way you carry things that were real, not as an active burden, not as an ongoing project, but as something that is simply part of you now, settled into the structure of how you think and move and encounter the world, no longer requiring attention because it has been absorbed. The daughters watched. Children always watch more carefully than adults imagine, and the daughters of these women were no different. They were attentive in the specific way of children who understand that the adult world contains information they are not permitted to have, and who therefore collect it by other means. Not eavesdropping exactly, or not only eavesdropping, something more patient and less deliberate, simply watching over the years, the way their mothers moved through rooms, the way certain silences had a particular quality, the way a carriage was ordered on afternoons when no social obligation seemed to require it. The children of the Gilded Age wealthy were raised in an atmosphere of extreme care and extreme limitation. Their days were managed by nurses and governesses. Their education was conducted according to plans that their parents, and primarily their mothers, had designed in consultation with the correct advisors. They were not, in the ordinary sense, free children. They did not play in the street. They did not run wild in parks. Their games were supervised, their friendships vetted, their reading materials selected. They lived from very young in the same managed atmosphere of social performance that their parents inhabited. And yet they saw things. The particular privilege of childhood is that adults sometimes forget that children are present, or discount the child's capacity to understand what is being said, or simply become too absorbed in their own concerns to manage every observation a child might make. A daughter who was sitting quietly at her needlework in a corner of the morning room while her mother received a visitor who was more warmly received than the usual visitors, and whose voice her mother used differently. This daughter was forming impressions that would not be fully understood for years. What they inherited from this knowledge, when they inherited anything at all, was not the specific knowledge of what had been arranged. Most of them never knew the specific arrangements. What they inherited was the attitude, the understanding that a life could be larger than its visible surface, that there were rooms behind rooms, that a woman who appeared to be completely present in the life that was displayed might also be, in some quieter and more private way, elsewhere. This inheritance was carried differently by different daughters. Some carried it as permission. The understanding that the performance was not the whole story gave them a certain freedom to look for what was not the performance, to ask what was behind it, to not be entirely satisfied with the surface. These were the daughters who became suffragists or painters or novelists, or who simply made marriages that were, by the standards of their mother's generation, unusually honest. They had learned, watching their mothers, that a fuller life was possible, even if the method of accessing it was not available to them in the same form. Others carried it as anxiety, the sense that there was a secret, that something important was being concealed, that the life they were growing up in was not quite what it appeared. This anxiety could become, in adult life, a generalized sense of unreality, a difficulty trusting surfaces, a tendency to look for the arrangement behind every arrangement. The gift of knowing that things were more complicated than they appeared was also a burden if you could not locate the specific complications and could only sense their presence. Consuelo Vanderbilt, who had been forced into her marriage at 18, and who spent years in a loveless alliance before achieving the divorce that freed her, wrote in her autobiography about her mother Alva with a mixture of understanding and resentment that only makes sense in the context of a woman who had been used. But she also wrote about what she eventually understood of her mother's inner life, the ambition that drove her, the genuine intelligence that the social world had no proper vessel for, the way that enormous energy had been channeled into the narrow available channels until those channels gave way. The daughters of the women who arranged substitutions grew up in a world that was already very slowly beginning to change. By the turn of the century, certain things that had been unthinkable were becoming merely unconventional. Women were attending universities, not in large numbers, but in numbers that were impossible to dismiss. Women were working in professions, as doctors, as lawyers, as journalists, as artists, in ways that the Gilded Age had not accommodated. The suffrage campaign was gaining momentum. Alva Belmont, Alva Vanderbilt, who had remade herself after her divorce, was one of its great financial engines and one of its most visible advocates. She had moved from the performance of social power to the exercise of actual political power, and in doing so she had demonstrated again that the transition was possible, that the energy and intelligence that the social world had insisted on receiving in only one form could be redirected without being diminished. The daughters who became suffragists, and there were many, were in some cases carrying forward what their mothers had prepared in private. The quiet attendance at the meetings, the careful funding of organisations whose work was almost entirely invisible to the social press, the conversations held in rooms where women could speak freely. These were the foundation on which the more public work was built. The private arrangements had been practice of a kind. Practice in managing a life that was larger than its official version. Practice in maintaining something important under conditions that required concealment. Practice in the particular skill of continuing to believe in what you value, when the world you live in gives you no public language for it. The daughters who inherited this practice, even without knowing the specific form it had taken in their mothers' lives, inherited something real, a way of moving through a constrained world without being entirely contained by it. The houses on Fifth Avenue are mostly gone now, torn down at various points in the 20th century to make way for office buildings and hotels. The Breakers still stands in Newport, preserved as a museum, and you can walk through it on a summer afternoon and see the rooms as they were. The marble floors, the ceiling frescoes, the dining room that seated 200 people at a single table. Tourists move through these spaces taking photographs of the grandeur, trying to imagine the life that was lived inside it. What is harder to imagine because it left fewer visible traces is the hidden life. The arrangements made in quiet rooms and unmade just as quietly. The afternoons spent elsewhere. The particular freedom of 2 or 3 hours in which the world did not know where you were or who you were or what you were doing and could not reach you with its requirements. This is the part that does not appear in the museum. It is the part that lived in the spaces between the rooms, in the back stairs, in the letters that were burned before they could be found, in the small changes in the air when a woman returned to herself after being briefly elsewhere, in the quality of a life that was lived more fully than it appeared to be, and in the daughters who watched and learned and carried forward something their mothers had never been able to name directly, but had demonstrated through patient practice was possible. The demonstration was quiet, the inheritance was quiet, the change it produced was slow, but it was real, and it went somewhere, and we are, in some of us, still carrying it. Something about this is worth resting in. The idea that a small, uncelebrated act of self-preservation can ripple forward in ways that are not visible at the time. The woman who locked her drawer and went to her suffrage meeting did not know she was doing anything historical. She was simply doing the thing she needed to do on a Tuesday afternoon, in the only way available to her. The Tuesday afternoon was its own complete thing. It did not need to lead anywhere, and yet it did. The daughters who carried this inheritance forward did not always know what they were carrying. This is perhaps the most interesting thing about inherited knowledge. It does not come with labels. It arrives as a disposition, a tendency, a way of reading a room that feels native rather than learned. The daughter who grew up watching her mother move through constrained spaces with a quality of interior reserve, the sense of a life being held carefully as something worth protecting, absorbed this without understanding it, the way children absorb the emotional weather of their households without being able to name what they are absorbing. By the time these daughters were grown and living their own lives, the world had shifted enough that some of what their mothers had needed to arrange in secret could be arranged more openly. Not entirely openly. The early 20th century had its own constraints, its own requirements, its own forms of managed performance, but differently. The suffrage campaign had produced, among other things, a public vocabulary for women's interior lives and women's desires that the Gilded Age had not possessed. A woman who wanted to vote was a suffragist. A woman who wanted to work was a new woman. These categories were contested and condescending and incomplete, but they existed, and their existence gave certain desires a shape that could be argued for rather than simply hidden. The daughters of the women in this story were among those who used that vocabulary. Some of them are in the historical record, women who organized, who published, who stood on platforms and said things that their mothers could not have said in any public context. Others are not in the record, or are in it only in the margins, the names in the footnotes of other people's biographies, the members of organizations whose minutes have been preserved. But they were shaped by what their mothers had prepared, even if the preparation had been silent, even if its full nature was never disclosed. What this story cannot tell us, because the records do not contain it, is whether any of these daughters ever learned what their mothers had done. Whether anyone, at some late hour in some quiet room, had said, "I want to tell you something that I have not told anyone." Whether the actress, years later, had encountered someone who looked like a woman she had once known and understood, from the resemblance, that she was looking at a daughter. Whether any of the arrangements were ever, in the long run of a life, admitted to. It is possible that none of them ever were. It is possible that the women who arranged these afternoons took the arrangements entirely with them when they died, burning what needed to be burned, carrying the rest in the interior place where the things that cannot be said are kept. This would not make the arrangements less real. It would simply make them private in the absolute sense, private all the way to the end, belonging to the person who made them and to no one else, which is in some ways the purest form of ownership available. Let us slow down here. Let us stay for a while in the pure sensory world of the city itself, the particular physical reality of New York in the 1880s and 1890s, which was a city unlike any that had existed before it, and unlike any that would exist after it. A city in the process of becoming something enormous, still organized around the horse and the gaslight and the rhythm of a life that moved at the speed of a walk or a slow carriage trot, but already pressing against the edges of that scale, already building the foundations of something different. The sound of Fifth Avenue in 1887 was the sound of hooves on cobblestone, a sound that was continuous during the daylight hours, a shifting rhythm of approach and departure, the heavy clop of draft horses pulling wagons and the lighter, quicker sound of carriage horses moving at a smart trot. Overlaid on this was the sound of the vendors who moved through the streets with carts, the vegetable sellers, the knife grinders with their distinctive call, the ragmen, the men who sold hot sweet potatoes in winter from small coal-fired barrels that smelled of scorched metal and caramel. These sounds came up through the windows of the great houses as through a membrane, muffled but present, the sound of a city that was not the same as the world inside the house but was its constant companion. In winter the sound changed. Cold hardened the cobblestones and made the hooves louder, more percussive. The wind off the Hudson pushed the smoke from the chimneys horizontally, and the city smelled of coal all the way from the docks to the park. In the great houses the fires burned in every room, and the coal was carried up and carried in, and the grates were cleaned every morning, and the cost of heating a Gilded Age mansion through a New York winter was itself an exercise in the public display of wealth. Warmth as luxury, warmth as statement. The gaslight was different from electric light, which was just beginning to appear in certain forward-thinking establishments, but which had not yet entirely replaced the gas that had illuminated the city for decades. Gaslight was warm and slightly yellow, and it moved, not dramatically but perceptibly, responding to the small air currents in a room, brightening and dimming with the breath of the occupants, making the shadows mobile in a way that electric light does not. A room lit by gas was a room in which the light itself was alive. Objects cast uncertain shadows. Faces had a quality of depth and warmth that the more clinical electric light would eventually take away. Thomas Edison had opened the first commercial electric power station in Lower Manhattan in 1882, just a few years before the period of our story. The lights he was selling, the incandescent bulbs that would eventually transform the look of the city, were initially available only within a small radius of the station on Pearl Street, and their adoption by wealthy households came gradually as the technology improved and the infrastructure expanded, and the wealthy decided that the newer, brighter, more controllable light was worth having. Some of them resisted longer than others. The yellow warmth of the gas lamp had its defenders. The transition from gaslight to electric light was, among other things, a transition in the quality of social space. The gaslight's warmth and movement created an atmosphere in which small imperfections were forgiven, in which the social performance was supported by the physical environment, the slight obscuring of detail, the flattering colour, the sense of a room that was breathing with you. The electric light was harsher. It showed things more clearly. Its adoption in the drawing rooms and dining rooms of the wealthy was, in a small way, a step in the direction of a more honest kind of social space. The smells of the city layered themselves in ways that were stratified by neighbourhood and by weather. Near the docks, the city smelled of salt water and fish, and the particular acrid smell of the waterfront industries. In the Tenderloin, the neighbourhood of theatres and saloons and less definable establishments that occupied the 20s and 30s west of Broadway, the smell was of tobacco and gas and cooking food from 100 small restaurants, and something organic and animal that the streets themselves contributed. On Fifth Avenue, the smell was of flowers, the flowers that the households kept in constant supply, and of good leather and wood polish, and the faint sweetness of expensive fabric. A woman moving between these neighbourhoods, which the actresses did regularly and the society women did almost never, moved through a series of distinct sensory environments as different from each other as different countries. The transition from the scented, controlled atmosphere of a Fifth Avenue drawing room to the ambient complexity of the streets below 14th Street was itself a kind of education in how much of the world was organised around the preferences of a very small number of people, and what the world smelled like when it was not so organised. The theatres were their own environment. The audience in a Gilded Age theatre arrived already a version of themselves, dressed, perfumed, positioned to be seen as well as to see, and the combination of all these people in a single room produced its own particular atmosphere. The smell of grease paint and size cloth from the stage mingled with the audience's perfumes, which in the 1880s were heavy and sweet by current standards, floral and musky and applied generously. The gas footlights were warm enough to be felt from the front rows. The velvet of the seat backs held a warmth that was partly the velvet itself, and partly the accumulated warmth of all the bodies that had sat in them through a long theatrical season. In this warm, scented dark, the boundary between the real and the performed was deliberately made porous. That was the point. You came to the theatre to have your sense of reality gently softened, to allow yourself to believe in something you knew was not true, to feel things that were technically fictional. The women of the Gilded Age who attended the theatre in their official capacity, in their boxes, in their evening gowns, with their husbands, were performing their own role while watching others perform, the levels of performance layered on each other. The theatres of this period were also social spaces of particular importance, because they were, in a technical sense, public spaces that nevertheless had a private quality in certain areas. The box was semi-private. You could be seen from the audience and the stage, but you could also have a quiet conversation within the box without being overheard, and the conventions of box visiting, the protocol by which men came to visit women in their boxes during the intervals, created a regulated but genuine opportunity for social interaction that was slightly less formal than what was possible in the drawing room. It was in the boxes and the intervals that certain conversations happened that could not happen anywhere else. The darkness, the noise, the slight loosening of structure that the theatre environment produced, these things created small opportunities. A woman in her box speaking to a visitor during the interval was slightly more herself than she was at a dinner party. The theatre did not permit complete honesty, but it permitted slightly more than usual. The street sounds of a Gilded Age New York night were different from the street sounds of the day. After midnight, the city's rhythm changed. The horse cars that ran along the great avenues stopped at midnight, and their absence produced a quieter, more irregular soundscape. The occasional carriage, the sound of a distant engine from the direction of the river, the voices of people on their way home from the theatres and the restaurants and the clubs. These voices carried differently in the quiet streets, arriving at upper floor windows as fragments of conversation, as laughter with no context, as the specific sound of people who are not being observed and have, for this late hour, relaxed their management of themselves. The woman at her writing desk in the hours past midnight heard these sounds and felt the specific loneliness and the specific freedom of being awake when most others are not. The city was still there. It was always still there. But at this hour it was a different version of itself. Not the performing city, not the social city, but the city at rest, the city between performances, the city as it actually was when no one was watching. In the quietest hours, the hours between 1 and 4 in the morning, when the theatre crowds had gone home and the delivery wagons had not yet started and the horse cars were still, the city was as close to silent as it ever got. And in those hours the woman at her writing desk could hear, if she listened, the very distant sound of the East River and the foghorns of the ships in the harbour, and the particular quietness that is not the absence of sound but the presence of a different kind, the sound of a city resting, the sound of something enormous that is for this moment still. Let yourself rest in that quiet now. The city below is doing what cities always do in the deep night, continuing, breathing, making its quiet machinery available to anyone who is awake enough to hear it. You are awake enough, or rather, you're at the edge of awake, at the border where the sound of things becomes the texture of sleep, where the city's nighttime quiet becomes the quiet of your own room, where the story of these women becomes the dream of a world that was real once and is still present, in some quality of the air, in some warmth in the dark. The story is almost over. What remains is the part that comes after all the particular details have been told, the part that exists in the space between the last event and the closing of the book, the part that is not about anything specific, but about the quality of the whole, the feeling of a story held in the mind as the mind begins to loosen its grip on things. The women we have been following are gone now. The arrangements they made are gone. The particular quality of their secret hours, the Tuesday afternoon in the borrowed room, the early morning walk on the cliff walk above the ocean, is gone in the sense that the specific experience of it is gone, held now only in whatever trace it left in the people who were there and in the accounts, partial and careful and strategically incomplete, that those people or their descendants eventually produced. What remains is the shape of the longing, and longing, it turns out, is more durable than most things. It outlasts its objects. It outlasts the specific circumstances that produced it. A woman who wanted 3 hours on a Tuesday afternoon in which the world did not know where she was, that specific desire, in that specific historical context, is long gone. But the desire for a space outside the performance, for hours that belong to no one's ledger, for the experience of existing without being observed, this is not gone. It is recognizable. It is present. It is probably present in this very room. The Gilded Age has a way of becoming an abstraction, a label for an era, a shorthand for a kind of excess, a television series, a historical period that ended more than a century ago. But it was also a series of particular women getting up in the morning and putting on clothes they needed help to fasten, and going through days that were organised around other people's requirements. The abstraction was their daily life. The historical period was Tuesday afternoon. Let the story settle now. Let the details drift. The gaslights and the pearls and the calling cards and the back stairs and the actresses and the borrowed rooms. Let these things find their place in the part of the mind that holds things softly, the part that does not require them to be anything except what they were. There is something restful in the end about other people's histories, about lives that were lived completely, with all their complications and constraints and small rebellions, and that are now finished, not in a sad sense, but in the sense that a story is finished. The ending has already happened. Nothing further is required. You do not need to worry about what came next, because you already know, or the not knowing is part of what makes the story a story rather than a news report. The past is safe in a way that the present is not. It has already become what it was going to be. The house on Fifth Avenue is dark now. The fire in the grate has gone fully out. There is nothing there now but a quiet warmth that will last another hour before the room becomes cold. The candles have been snuffed. The calling cards in the silver dish are still. The mantel clock is still ticking, in the particular patient way of a clock that has been ticking through every kind of night and has learned to find no drama in any of them. The woman at the writing desk has put down her pen. The instructions she was writing, the careful specific instructions about where to sit and how to pour and what to say, to the woman who asks about the summer plans, have been folded and sealed and put in the drawer where they will wait until morning, when they will be delivered by a trusted hand to address on a quieter street. Tomorrow, things will be set in motion. Tonight, there is nothing to be set in motion. Tonight, everything is still. She is tired in the good way, the way you're tired after doing something that required your full attention and went right. The kind of tired that the body does not resist but welcomes, the kind that has already begun dissolving the day's architecture into the gentler material of almost sleep. She closes the drawer. She moves to the window for one more moment and looks down at the street below, where a single cab is making its way north at the late-night pace, the horse moving slowly, the driver hunched against the cold, the lamplight reflected in the wet cobblestones in pools that stretch and shrink as the cab moves past each lamp. The cab is unhurried. It has somewhere to be and all night to get there. It moves through the pools of light and into the dark between them, and through the next pool and onward, becoming smaller, becoming a sound, becoming finally nothing but the faint clop of hooves somewhere down the avenue. She lets the curtain fall. She crosses the room. The bed is ready. The covers turned back by the maid hours ago, the pillow already holding the impression of rest. She sets aside the last of the day's performance, not dramatically, not with the violence of relief, simply sets it aside, the way you set aside a coat you have been wearing, with the quiet gesture of a person who has been outside and is now inside, and who knows the difference. The room is dark. The clock ticks. The city breathes below. The story is over, or rather it is not over, but it has reached the place where stories and sleep share a border, the place where the details become less important than the feeling, where the feeling becomes less important than the quiet, where the quiet becomes everything, becomes the room, becomes the warmth under the covers, becomes the slow, reliable weight of a body resting. Rest now. You have been somewhere good. You can return there any time. It will always be there. The gaslight and the pearls and the borrowed afternoon and the woman who was briefly nowhere the world could find her. It will always be there, held softly in the part of you that holds good things, waiting for the next time you need it. There is something that happens in the last part of a long story. The details that were vivid in the middle, the particular name, the specific arrangement, the exact shade of gaslight on a specific wall, begin to lose their edges. Not because they are less true, but because the mind, which has been holding them with effort, begins to release that effort, and in the releasing the details return to the general category of past things, which is their proper home. The Gilded Age is past in this way. Not gone. Nothing human is entirely gone, because the human things always leave traces in the people who came after, but past in the sense of completed. The specific tensions that made the arrangements possible and necessary, the specific constraints that required such ingenuity to navigate, the specific social world that made a married woman's Tuesday afternoon into a matter requiring such elaborate management. All of this is past. The world moved on from it, slowly and incompletely but genuinely, in the direction of something that allowed women slightly more Tuesday afternoons of their own, and then more still. The movement was slow enough that no single woman could have watched it happen. You cannot observe the progress of something that moves on the timescale of decades. You can only live in the conditions that are available to you, and use the means available to you to live in those conditions as fully as possible, and pass forward to whatever comes after you, whatever it was that you managed to preserve. The women who arranged substitutions in the 1880s did not know they were participating in a larger movement toward women's autonomy. They were simply trying to get to a Tuesday afternoon meeting, or a rented room, or a small recital in a way that would not cost them everything else. The trying is enough. This is something that stories about the past can offer that other things cannot. The reassurance that the trying, even when it produces no spectacular result, even when it ends with everything put back exactly as it was, is not wasted. It is not wasted because it changes the person who did the trying, and the person who was changed goes on to change other things in the quiet and incremental way that most actual change works, without announcement, without attribution, without a clear line from cause to effect that anyone can point to later and say, "There, that is where it started." The city is quiet now. The particular city we have been inhabiting, the gaslit city, the carriage city, the city of calling cards and afternoon teas, and the complicated social machinery of a world that ran on the labour of maintaining appearances, that city is thoroughly past. But the city where people are trying to find a few hours outside the frame of what is expected of them, trying to locate themselves in the space between who they are required to be and who they are, that city is not past. It is the city you live in. It is probably the city you're in right now. Something about this is a comfort, not a triumphant comfort, not the comfort of having solved anything, but the quieter comfort of knowing that the wanting is very old and very widespread and does not belong to any single era or circumstance. The woman who managed her pearls and her calling cards and her afternoons in the 1880s, and the person reading this story in the present are not the same, and their constraints are not the same, and the specific shape of what they wanted is not the same. But something in the wanting is the same. Something in the desire for an hour that belongs to no one's ledger. Something in the hunger for the experience of being somewhere the world cannot quite reach you. This is recognizable across whatever distance separates the telling from the hearing of the story. The house on Fifth Avenue is dark. The fire has been out for a long time. The clock on the mantelpiece has been moved to a museum somewhere, or lost in the dispersal of an estate, or is still ticking somewhere in a storage room behind a velvet rope, patient and unhurried in the way that clocks are when no one is listening to them. The calling cards have dissolved. The pearls have passed through many hands since the ones that held them in this story, each pair of hands warming them briefly and then releasing them, the pearls remembering nothing, as objects do. What remains is this, a story. The particular warmth of a story that is over, that happened, that is true in the way that past things are true, completely, and without the possibility of revision, held in whatever form the telling has given it. You have been somewhere real. The gaslight was real. The pearls were real. The borrowed afternoon was real, and the woman who spent it, and the woman who made it possible, and the city that contained them both without knowing or caring what it was containing. Let it settle now. Let the story find its place among the other things you hold softly, the things that do not need to be useful, that do not need to lead anywhere, that simply are what they are, evidence that people have always been trying, in whatever way was available to them, to be more than the performance asked for. That is enough. That has always been enough. And the asking, the old patient recurring asking, is something worth carrying into sleep. The night is complete. The story has gone where stories go when they are finished, somewhere quiet, somewhere that asks nothing of you, somewhere that simply holds the thing it was given and keeps it safe. The house is still now. The calling cards are in their dish. The pearls are in their case. The fire has gone out. The mantel clock ticks in the empty room, alone and patient, the way clocks are always alone and patient, marking time that no one is watching pass. There is nothing left in this room that requires your attention, nothing arriving, nothing departing. The night has finished doing what it does, which is to arrive, and the rest, what comes after, what the morning will bring, what the day will require, is still a long way off. You are resting. You have been resting for some time, perhaps longer than you know. The story has been carrying you the way a slow current carries something that has stopped trying to swim, gently, without urgency, in a direction that requires nothing from you except the willingness to float. Float a little longer, the house is still, the clock is ticking. The city below is making its quietest sounds, the sounds of a city that has almost let go of the day, that is hovering in the last hour before even the night's traffic ceases. These sounds are not the sounds of anything happening. They are simply the sound of the world being present, warm and continuous, as it always is when you're not listening for it specifically. You are comfortable, you are warm, the weight of the quilt, the pillow, the bed. These things are doing what they do, which is hold you. And being held, even by something as simple and material as a bed, is a good thing. It is enough. It is more than enough. Let the story dissolve the way all stories dissolve when the person holding them falls asleep. Not all at once, but in layers, the details first, then the events, then the characters, and finally even the feeling, until what remains is not the story itself, but something the story made. A quietness, a warmth, a vague and pleasant sense of having been somewhere you recognized as real, even though it was not yours. Sleep. The night is long. The story will be here in the morning, or the memory of it will be, which is enough. For now, there is nothing except this, the room, the darkness, the slow, even breathing that has already, without your deciding, become the breathing of someone who is almost not awake anymore. Good night. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And here's something to think about. If you could step away from your daily life for one afternoon and go anywhere, completely unrecorded just for yourself, where would you go? Leave your answer in the comments.